Daenerys Targaryen knelt in the coarse sand and stared at the smoldering horizon. The sulphurous tang of dragonfire clung to the air, making it difficult to breathe. She had grown so used to the smell of ash and burning flesh that it hardly registered anymore. But this time, a tremor of dread unfurled in the pit of her stomach, coiling itself around her heart. She could still feel the tremble of the ground under her knees, the vibration of massive wings beating against the sky, and the echoes of a roar that had once been her salvation. Now it felt like a death knell. Drogon had circled overhead in an eerie silence. No joyous cry of recognition when he saw his mother on the ground, no triumphant roar after unleashing his flames. Instead, the great black dragon had turned his colossal head toward her. Yellow eyes burnished like molten gold, and a low growl, full of warning, had rumbled from his throat. That was the moment Daenerys realized her dominion was coming undone. Her hair was a tangled mess of silver strands clinging to her cheeks. She couldn't remember the last time she had braided it properly. Dust crusted the corners of her eyes, and tears she refused to shed stung behind her lids. Drogon's looming silhouette still cast a shadow over the battlefield, but he no longer flew to her side. He hovered at a distance, near enough to watch but far enough to declare his independence. Daenerys felt the harsh dryness of Essos's wind scraping her skin. She had once considered this land an extension of her destiny, a place she would liberate before returning to Westeros to claim her birthright. Yet in this single moment, she felt the land itself turn against her spirit. A queen without her dragon was like a lion without claws, still fierce in her heart, but robbed of her greatest weapon. Her loyal unsullied, those who remained alive and uninjured, stood uncertainly in a semicircle, their spears lowered, their gazes shifting between Daenerys and her rampaging beast. Grey Worm bled from a slash across his collarbone, but he held formation, unwavering in posture, though his eyes betrayed concern. It was a concern not simply for Daenerys' life, but for the fracturing of their unstoppable force. For so long, the queen had been a figure of awe, astride or beside the greatest creatures in the world. If that bond were severed, what would become of them? No amount of discipline could keep fear from creeping into their hearts. A moan from the ground to her right drew Daenerys' attention. A dying man, a Sellsword who had once worn her colors, reached out with a trembling hand. His face was charred along one side, eyes seared nearly blind by dragon flame. Before she could say or do anything, the man's arm slackened, and he died with lips parted, as though he had been about to utter a final plea. Daenerys swallowed a breath. She wanted to curse the cruelty of fate, but she no longer possessed the words. Battle wore down on everyone, even the breaker of chains. Yet this was something far more frightening than any mere skirmish for territory. She rose unsteadily, boots sinking into the bloody sand. The day had begun with the promise of a decisive victory against one of the last great slavers in Essos, a man named Morco who had taken advantage of the fracturing of her empire. Spies told her Morco had holed up with his men near a wide river delta a week's ride from Meereen, forging alliances with smaller Sellsword companies, bribing local warlords, consolidating grain supplies and stoking unrest. Confident in the might of her unsullied and her most fearsome dragon, Daenerys had marched to meet him. First, it had all gone according to plan. Drogon's flames had driven Morco's lines into disarray. The unsullied advanced. Triumph was at hand. Then, without warning, Drogon had turned from torching the enemy ranks and roared at Daenerys' own men. He'd inflicted carnage on both sides, ravaging friend and foe alike. She could hardly believe her eyes when the first wave of her own men fell to dragonfire. She tried shouting, commanding Drogon to cease, but it was as though he had forgotten her voice. The bond that once felt unbreakable snapped like a brittle thread. Drogon's roar hammered through the sky, and a storm of fire swallowed the battlefield. Daenerys screamed until her throat burned. She yelled words in High Valyrian she had once used so effectively. She commanded him to listen, to obey, to calm. But her pleas drowned in the inferno of Drogon's fury. When the flames finally subsided, Daenerys had scrambled through the carnage, calling for Grey Worm, for Yora, for Missandei, anyone. She found Grey Worm, wounded but alive. Yora was nowhere to be seen, though the days of his banishment had still pressed a wedge between them. Missandei knelt by the remains of her translator's pack, hands shaking, tears streaking her cheeks as she tended to a young soldier with fatal burns. Daenerys had no illusions about the illusions of victory now. Morco, that cunning slaver, might have died in Drogon's rampage, or he might have fled in the chaos. She scarcely cared. The horror overshadowed any strategic gain. Drogon landed at the far edge of the battlefield amid swirling dust, massive wings folding against his black-scaled body. His roar reverberated through Daenerys's bones. For one fleeting moment, she thought he might lower his head in supplication, might remember the countless times she'd stroked the ridge of his neck and fed him morsels of cooked meat, singing him lullabies in the old tongue. Instead, he growled, shook out his wings as though dislodging a pest, and took to the sky once more. A hush settled, broken only by moans of the dying and the scrape of unsullied spears as they took stock of themselves. Daenerys approached Grey Worm, breath ragged. "We must go," she said, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Before Drogon, before he comes back." Grey Worm glanced skyward. The silhouette of the great dragon cut across the sun like a shard of obsidian. "Where can we go, Your Grace?" he asked. His face, though stoic, was etched with confusion and an emotion dangerously close to despair. Daenerys wanted to answer with confidence, to proclaim that they would regroup and redouble their strength. But the words tasted like ash. Her entire power rested on 3 dragons, on the birth of a new age she would usher in. With Drogon so clearly beyond her control, the promise of the Iron Throne felt farther away than ever. And yet old instincts kicked in. Once she had nothing but a name, Targaryen. She would endure. She had to. "We go back to Meereen," she said. "We'll tend our wounded. We'll decide what must be done." Grey Worm nodded, though his eyes flicked to the sky again. Daenerys could sense the unspoken question that trembled on his lips. Would Drogon hunt them, devour them on the way? She had no certain answers. She could only gather the tattered remnants of her army and march, leaving behind the scorched remains of those who had been both friend and foe. In the distance, Drogon roared once more, as if warning her not to forget who was truly powerful now. They set out in a ragged procession, the living assisting the barely living, and the dead left to the crows. The sun beat down like a merciless tyrant. Missandei hovered by Daenerys' side, silent tears leaving small trails on her dusty cheeks. Daenerys reached out and clasped her hand briefly. No words passed between them, but the gesture said enough. "We are both still here. We must be strong." They walked until the horizon melted into waves of shimmering heat. Along the way, they caught glimpses of Drogon high above, circling in lazy arcs, not attacking but not disappearing. Occasionally, the monstrous shadow would swoop lower, sending waves of panic through their lines. At one point, the dragon let out a snorting huff of flame in the distance, as though toying with them. Then he soared away into the pale sky. Daenerys' heart hammered each time. Part of her still believed he would come back to her, that he would recall her touch and land at her side. Another part, a much deeper part, began to accept that Drogon was truly lost. When they finally reached Meereen, they found the city in an uneasy quiet. Smoke still curled from braziers along the towering walls, and the gates creaked open upon their approach. The Unsullied on guard duty looked startled by the disarray of Daenerys' returning force. Many recognized the deep despair in their queen's eyes, though none dared question her in public. Missandei's exhaustion was clear, too, her posture sagging with every step. Grey Worm kept his back straight, ignoring his wound, refusing to show weakness before his men. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the Mother of Dragons had prevailed or been broken. Daenerys trudged inside the Great Pyramid, passing under sculpted reliefs of her own visage, the architecture that once proclaimed her as a savior and conqueror. The oppressive hush in the corridors made her skin crawl. Memories assaulted her. The day she first took the city, freeing the slaves, hearing them chant Mysa, Mysa, felt like a lifetime ago. She brushed off the courtiers and attendants who hurried forward, seeking to greet or question her. She needed solitude to think. Missandei and Grey Worm followed her into the throne room, where the seat of the queen loomed atop a short flight of steps. Daenerys did not ascend those steps. Instead, she sank onto one of the lower steps and let her hands drop between her knees, head bowed. Grey Worm began speaking, listing the casualties, but she cut him off with a gesture. She couldn't bear to hear it yet. Missandei cleared her throat, speaking softly. "Your Grace, you've traveled far without rest. Perhaps." But Daenerys raised her eyes to fix Missandei with a hollow gaze. "Bring me a goblet of water," she said, "and have the healers see to everyone, including Grey Worm." Her voice remained oddly calm, but inside, her soul writhed with torment. "Let me be for a moment. I must think." Missandei nodded and withdrew, and Grey Worm offered a low bow before leaving as well. Their footsteps receded into the expanse of the throne room, and Daenerys was finally alone. Candlelight flickered across the polished floors. She focused on the trembling reflection of her own face in the marble. A queen undone by her own dragon. She had endured so many hardships. Brotherly abuse, the Dothraki, the birth of her dragons, betrayals of advisors, and countless battles. Yet this blow seemed to cut deeper than any other. Drogon had been like a child to her, the largest and most temperamental, true, but also the one who had always come to her rescue when she needed him most. She remembered the fighting pits in Meereen, when the sons of the Harpy cornered her. Drogon had erupted from the sky, unstoppable and glorious, saving her. She recalled clinging to his neck, the wind tearing at her hair, feeling closer to him than anyone else in the world. The bond that day had felt unbreakable. Now she trembled at the memory, feeling the sting of betrayal. But was it truly betrayal? Dragons were not dogs. They could not be tamed so easily, not even by Targaryen blood. Perhaps it was her hubris, believing she was more than just another mortal in Drogon's eyes. The heavy sound of the throne room doors opening made her lift her head. Jorah Mormont stood there, leaning heavily on a cane. His clothing was singed, and he bore fresh scars along his arms, but somehow he was still alive. Daenerys inhaled sharply. She had not seen him in the aftermath of the battle, had wondered if he was among the burned. He limped forward, gaze flicking up to find her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daenerys broke the silence, her voice trembling. "I thought you were dead." He inclined his head. "I nearly was." The words came out with a note of rueful humor. "Dragonfire is quick, but I managed to throw myself behind a boulder. Got a bit scorched, but it could have been worse." He stepped closer, his limp pronounced. "Your Grace, I wanted to make sure you were all right." His eyes roved over her, noticing the ash, the streaks of blood, the worn expression. "I heard rumors on the road." That Drogon turned. Daenerys stared at him, then exhaled a shaky breath. "He did. He has. I don't know." She pressed her palms against her temples. "It happened so fast. We lost so many men. I couldn't stop him." Her voice broke on that final sentence, as though speaking the words made them real in a way that scorched her soul. Jorah placed a hand on her shoulder gently. "Dragons are not horses. They are living embodiments of fire and scale. Bond or no, we can't command them the way we command soldiers." His words were tender, but there was no comfort to be found. "I'm sorry, Khaleesi." She shook her head. The old Dothraki title stung with longing for a simpler time, when she was a young bride dreaming of a stallion who would mount the world. "I can't be sorry. I need a plan. I need to find him or stay away from him. Gods, I don't know." Jorah let out a ragged sigh. "Perhaps it would be best to fortify the city and protect your people. If Drogon roams the skies, the countryside could be terrorized. We need to keep the city from descending into chaos." She knew he was right. She nodded wearily. "Send out patrols to warn nearby settlements. The last thing we need is panic. If Drogon descends on farmland, people will die. And they'll blame me." Jorah hesitated, then said, "Your Grace, Some of them are already blaming you. Word spreads fast. You know how rumor feeds on fear. Many believe the breaker of chains lost her dragon because she lost her right to rule. He paused, letting the meaning sink in. They say the gods themselves have turned on you. Daenerys' throat tightened. She had never been one to cower before rumors, but this was more than idle gossip. She could feel the edges of her reign loosening, the foundations trembling. She swallowed. Then let's ensure they do not see me cower. I will remain here for now, secure Meereen, and see to it that my people are safe. Drogon. If he attacks the city, we must be ready. But if he doesn't, if he merely roams, we'll track him. Perhaps he'll calm in time. Jorah nodded. His gaze flicked to the throne behind her. She stood and turned to face that seat of power, so often a symbol of her conquests. Now it felt more like a burden. Slowly, she ascended the steps and settled into it. She sat there, shoulders squared, chin lifted in the posture of a queen. But the emptiness in her chest remained, a hollow echo where her bond with Drogon once resided. She forced her voice to steady. Lord Mormont, gather the officers. We must address the city at dawn. He bowed and left without another word, leaving Daenerys alone under the cold torchlight. She knew that in the coming days, the story of her betrayal by her own dragon would spread through the streets, carried on trembling lips. The mother of these creatures had lost her claim to motherhood. She felt the weight of the future pressing upon her. Her war for the Iron Throne, her dream of breaking the wheel, all of it threatened by the loss of her greatest ally. But Daenerys Targaryen was no stranger to adversity. She closed her eyes, forcing her breath to even out, and resolved to rise from the ashes as she always had. Yet a whisper of doubt curled in her mind, reminding her that all the strength of her Unsullied and all the love of her freedmen might not be enough to overcome a dragon's wrath. That night, Daenerys hardly slept. She paced her chambers, peering out into the darkness for any sign of a passing shadow. Every gust of wind felt like the whoosh of giant wings. Sometimes she recalled Drogon's purring presence in her dreams. Other times, she was jolted awake by nightmares of black flames consuming her. When dawn finally broke, it did so with a listless gray light that matched her somber mood. She dressed in subdued colors, a simple gown of dark red and charcoal, a far cry from her regal whites and blues that once proclaimed her as the bright spark of liberation. She pinned her silver hair back into a single braid. Her reflection in the polished mirror showed a woman older than her years, eyes heavy with grief and determination. In the audience hall, the gathered officers of the Unsullied stood in orderly rows. Representatives of various freedmen, craftspeople, and the city's scribes joined them. Some of the more influential freedmen, once her staunchest supporters, wore worried expressions. Missandei stood to one side, hands clasped in front of her, lips pressed into a thin line. Grey Worm bore a fresh bandage on his shoulder, but he held himself proud and straight. Jorah, leaning on his cane, stood at the edge of the group, silent but present. Daenerys took her place before them, not on the throne but at the base of the steps. She drew a breath. "You have all heard the news," she began, voice carrying through the hall. "Drogon has caused havoc on the battlefield. We sustained terrible losses. I mourn every man and woman who perished, whether fighting for me or forced to fight against me by slavers' whips. This tragedy is immeasurable." She paused, allowing a wave of hushed murmurs to pass. "We must protect Meereen from further harm. Drogon is out there. He may come here, he may fly elsewhere. We cannot predict his movements, but we can prepare. Grey Worm, I charge you with reinforcing the city's defenses. Jorah will work with the city's leadership to ensure we have contingency plans for evacuation if needed." She held up a hand to forestall the questions she saw forming on their faces. "I know many of you wonder how I let this happen. Dragons are not weapons one can lock in a chest. They are living creatures. Drogon was born of fire and magic at the edge of the world. He is bound to me by blood, but we do not control blood as easily as we command armies. I will do all in my power to see this right, to ensure no more innocent blood is shed. But in the meantime, I ask for your patience and your faith." Her voice wavered on that final word, but she pressed on. "I have given much to free Essos from its chains. I promise you, I will not abandon this city or its people. We stand together." Her short speech ended, and the crowd shifted uncertainly. Some looked relieved by her resolve. Others exchanged glances betraying their doubts. The memory of scorched allies lingered in many minds. Daenerys could see it in their eyes. Fear, uncertainty, the seeds of betrayal. She silently thanked the gods that the city still had Grey Worm's unwavering loyalty. As long as the Unsullied obeyed her, the city would not descend into chaos. But the hearts of the freedmen, would they remain loyal if Drogon's shadow fell upon them? She dismissed the gathering, letting them return to their tasks. Grey Worm approached to confirm the defensive plans, bowing stiffly. Jorah lingered until most of the crowd dispersed, then joined Daenerys near a massive pillar carved with depictions of old Giscari conquests. The irony was not lost on her. Once, she had replaced some of these images with scenes of freedom, but the old stone told older stories. "I'll coordinate with the city leaders," Jorah murmured. "We'll need stores of grain, medical supplies, and a plan to shelter families in safer quarters. I'm not certain how we defend against a dragon, though. Even scorpions or ballistae may not be enough if Drogon truly means to attack." Daenerys nodded, her face grim. "I know. All we can do is try, and hope." He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, and he softened his tone. "Dragons outlive men, but sometimes they go feral. It said that in ancient Valyria, dragon would sometimes turn on their riders if they sensed weakness, or if they were approached at the wrong moment. This may not be about you, Daenerys. It may simply be Drogon's nature." She knew he was trying to comfort her, but the words only twisted the knife deeper. "He is my blood," she whispered, "and I thought that meant something more. Perhaps I was wrong." Jorah hesitated, then gently touched her elbow. "You are not wrong, Khaleesi, but you must be strong, or the city will tremble at the first sign of your doubt." She took a moment to compose herself, then gave a curt nod. "We'll do what must be done. Now go, Jorah. See to it that our defenses and supplies are secured." He left her, and she stood alone beneath the silent gargoyles and pillars, feeling the weight of the city on her shoulders. In that moment, she wished she could simply run away, ride a horse across the grasslands and disappear into anonymity. But that was never her path. She was Daenerys Stormborn, the unburnt, the breaker of chains, and even if Drogon turned his flames against her, she had to carry on. The next few days passed in tense vigilance. Daenerys spent countless hours conferring with her officers and advisors, overseeing the distribution of food to calm the citizens' fears, and posting watchmen on the highest vantage points around Meereen. Yet Drogon did not appear. Scouts ventured into the countryside, returning with stories of black wings spotted in distant skies, or farmland burned to cinders, livestock devoured, entire caravans attacked. The rumors spread like wildfire among the populace, and with each new report, Daenerys felt the city's faith in her slip further. She took little rest, prowling the halls of the Great Pyramid like a restless ghost. Missandei tried to console her, urging her to eat more than a few mouthfuls of bread, to sleep more than an hour at a time. Daenerys would only reply, "Not while my people live in fear." She penned letters to the other cities she had once liberated, Yunkai, Astapor, imploring them to remain vigilant against Drogon and to stand united against the slavers who might exploit this turmoil. Those letters were sent with her fastest riders, though Daenerys doubted they would do much good. Both Yunkai and Astapor had proven unstable once freed. Their rebellious natures might see this as a chance to cast off her rule. On the fourth day after the battle, Jorah entered her solar with a grim look. "We've received word from a caravan that arrived at the eastern gates," he said. "Refugees from a small settlement. They claim Drogon razed their village. Some were burned alive, others fled into the desert. They're begging for sanctuary." Daenerys gripped the edge of a table. "Gods," she breathed. "How many survivors?" 70 or so. Yora tugged at his coat's singed sleeves. They tell a terrible tale. Drogon descended in the night like a black storm. They say he roared, setting everything ablaze. No one could fight him. Her stomach twisted. She had known Drogon was out there, dangerous and uncontrolled, but the reality of his rampage cut her to the quick. These were innocent people who once looked to her as their liberator. Now they cowered in terror of the beast she had unleashed. "We must provide them shelter," she said. "Ensure they have food and medicine." Yora nodded. "It's done. But I must warn you, some among them blame you openly. They say if you cannot control your dragon, you have no right to rule." She bowed her head. The shame and guilt weighed on her. "Let them blame me," she whispered, voice trembling. "They are not wrong. This is what you told me once," Yora replied gently. "If I look back, I am lost. So look forward, Daenerys. We'll do what must be done. Always." He left, cane tapping on the marble floor. Daenerys's thoughts churned like a storm. She recalled the 3 heads of the dragon from her house's sigil, the prophecy that had danced around her dreams. The dragon has 3 heads. Rhaegal and Viserion had been lost in other tragedies, one to an icy monster in the far north in a vision, or in some telling if we merge show/canon lore, though in a pure textual scenario, their fates might differ. Drogon was the only one left, the only living testament to her lineage. Now that testament had turned to devastation. The prophecy mocked her. What good was her Targaryen blood if it could not command the last living dragon? 2 more days passed before Daenerys received word of Drogon again. This time, the messenger was a breathless scout who collapsed in the throne room, rasping for water. Guards gave him a cup, and he stammered out his report. "The city of Hazdan to the north. Drogon attacked 2 nights ago. The city wall collapsed under his fire. Many died, including the small force that once swore allegiance to you, your grace." The entire court fell silent. Daenerys's face hardened. She remembered Hazdan. She had visited it months ago, proclaiming an end to the slave markets. Now the city lay in ruins. She felt an icy coil wrap around her heart. Some might take relief that Drogon had not stormed Meereen yet, but the cost of his rampage in the broader region was staggering. It would only add to the voices clamoring for her abdication or her head. That evening, Daenerys could no longer endure passivity. She summoned Grey Worm, Yora, and a handful of her most trusted captains to her solar. Their faces were grim, illuminated by lanterns that cast long shadows on the tapestries. She stood before them, hands clasped tightly. "We cannot wait for Drogon to come here," she said. "We must find him. We must attempt to stop him, or at least drive him away from populated areas." Her words prompted uncertain glances. Grey Worm spoke first. "Stop a dragon, your grace? We have ballistae, do we not?" She responded sharply. "Scorpions from the old siege weapons, left behind by the Yunkai. We can modify them. Use them to wound Drogon if it comes to that." Yora stepped forward, eyes keen. "If you wound him, you risk turning him even more savage. And I fear your men won't stand a chance if Drogon decides to fight back." Daenerys's jaw tightened. "Do you think I do not know that?" She snapped, then reined in her temper. "I cannot stand by while he destroys cities. The people will suffer, and all I've accomplished will be undone. We have to try." Grey Worm's face was impassive. "The Unsullied will do as you command, your grace," he said. "But it will be dangerous." Yora nodded agreement. "If the intention is to kill Drogon, there will be fewer places for your enemies to gather fear as a weapon against you. But if you kill him, you lose the last living symbol of House Targaryen. And you risk turning public sentiment further against you. The city might fear a queen who slaughters her own child. It's a precarious dilemma." Daenerys's shoulders sagged. For so long, Drogon had been a source of unwavering strength and legitimacy. But she could not let him ravage Essos. She pressed a hand to her brow. "I do not want to kill him. I want to subdue him if that's even possible. Wound him enough that I can approach and remind him of our bond. Or at least drive him away from civilization." We can't simply let him burn everything to the ground. Yora exhaled, heavy with concern. Then we'll gather the ballistae, but we'll equip them with smaller harpoons, something that might snag his wing or slow him down, but not necessarily kill. It's risky, but I see no other option. Daenerys nodded. Arrange it. We leave in 3 days. We'll make a show of strength, a portion of the Unsullied, plus any archers we can spare. I'll ride out with them. Grey Worm frowned. Your Grace, it may be too dangerous for you to be present. She met his gaze, eyes cold. And how would my men react if their queen cowers in her pyramid while they march to face a dragon? I will be there. Perhaps, if Drogon sees me, he will remember. She swallowed hard. He must remember. With that, the meeting ended on a subdued note. Daenerys lingered after the others had gone, staring into the guttering lantern light. She recalled the first time Drogon breathed fire at her command, a timid spurt of flames that left her awestruck. The small miracle of that day felt like a dream now. She was left with the bitter knowledge that even a miracle could grow monstrous if its heart turned dark. When the day came to set out, Daenerys donned leather armor reinforced at the shoulders, a practical outfit meant for desert travel. The sun reflected harshly off the polished edges, and sweat beaded on her brow as she stood at the head of her force. Grey Worm had lined up the Unsullied in disciplined ranks, their spears glinting. A dozen new ballistae on wagon carriages followed, each manned by teams of 4. The men looked stoic, but Daenerys sensed the undercurrent of fear. Many of these soldiers had seen Drogon's fury firsthand. Citizens watched from the sidelines, some with worried frowns, others with tears in their eyes. A group of refugees from outlying villages held up cloth banners that read, "Save us, Mysa." She tried to glean courage from their pleas, but shame gnawed at her. Drogon was her responsibility, yet how little control she had. She mounted a tall white horse that had belonged to a fallen officer, and Missandei approached to bid farewell, her eyes wet. "Please be careful," she whispered. "I cannot bear to see you come to harm." Daenerys reached out and squeezed Missandei's hand. "I promise to return," she said, though she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. "This city is our home now, yours and mine. I won't let Drogon turn me into a coward." She led her contingent through the gates under the scorching midday sun. The plan was to move northward, where scouts had last seen the dragon. On the second day of travel, the desert gave way to rolling hills, dry grass, and crumbling ruins of past civilizations. Everyone moved in tense silence, eyes scanning the horizon. Occasionally, dust devils whirled across the plains, but no sign of black wings marred the sky. Daenerys felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that he had not ambushed them, dread that they might never find him until it was too late. On the third morning, a scout galloped back to the main column, breathless. "Your Grace," he said to Daenerys, "there's a smoldering settlement 2 leagues ahead. We saw huge claw marks in the fields, burned livestock. Drogon was here." Her heart lurched. "How long ago?" "Not sure, maybe a day, maybe hours. The tracks lead west." She nodded, turning to Grey Worm and Yora. "We follow." The men stirred, passing orders down the line. The Unsullied resumed their march, while the ballista wagon teams kept a steady pace. When they finally reached the settlement, the afternoon sun hung low. Smoke rose in thin plumes from charred huts. The stench of burnt flesh assaulted them. Daenerys urged her horse forward through the rubble, eyes stinging. A handful of survivors watched from behind half-collapsed walls, their expressions etched with raw fear. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, eyes red from smoke. One young boy stepped forward, tears carving paths on his soot-blackened face. He raised a trembling arm, pointing at Daenerys. "He came from the sky," the boy whispered, "spitting fire. Why didn't you stop him?" The words pierced Daenerys like a dagger. She had no answer that could ease his pain. She dismounted, knelt, and gently squeezed his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We came as soon as we could." But sorrow was not enough. She saw the disappointment and anger in the boy's eyes. It was the gaze of someone who believed in her legend, only to find a mortal woman. She stood, shoulders weighted by guilt, and turned to her men. "Offer them what food and water we can spare. Let the healers tend their wounds. Then we press on before nightfall." They followed Drogon's path westward. At dusk, a red sun bathed the horizon in blood. Daenerys felt the knot in her stomach tighten. The wind changed direction, carrying an acrid scent. She recognized it all too well, dragon smoke. Then she heard the echo of a distant roar. Her eyes snapped to the horizon, where black shapes fluttered among the clouds. Fear rippled through the ranks. Grey Worm signaled the ballistic teams to be ready. Soldiers hurried to load bolts tipped with barbed hooks. Daenerys felt her throat go dry. She remembered how majestic Drogon looked, how unstoppable. Even these war machines might barely scratch him. And if he turned his wrath upon them, how many lives would she forfeit in the attempt? They set up a crude perimeter around a rocky hill, positioning the ballistae at different angles. Torches flared as the evening deepened into night. The sound of scuttling men and the grind of wheels merged into a tense symphony. Daenerys remained on her horse, scanning the darkening sky. Suddenly, a silhouette of massive wings soared across the crescent moon, and a shiver ran through everyone present. Drogon was close. A hush fell. Daenerys raised a hand, urging her forces to hold steady. An electric tension charged the air. Seconds later, a monstrous roar shattered the silence. Drogon descended like a falling comet, black scales shimmering, fire licking at the edges of his maw. Daenerys's heart nearly stopped at the sight of him. He was even larger than she remembered, or so it seemed under the flicker of torches. His roar vibrated the very ground, scattering the smaller animals from the brush. The Unsullied knelt, bracing spears. The ballista operators took aim, sweat gleaming on their brows. For one breathtaking moment, Drogon hovered overhead, wings beating slow and powerful gusts that flattened the grass. His eyes glowed with a feral intelligence, fixed on the massed soldiers. Daenerys urged her horse forward a few steps, swallowing her terror. "Drogon!" she called, her voice thin in the wind. "Drogon, I am here." She spoke in High Valyrian, the language of dragons. "You know me." The black dragon tilted his head, releasing a low, guttural growl. A flicker of recognition? She wanted to believe it. She raised both arms, palms open, as if beckoning him into an embrace. "Drogon, come to me," she repeated. The moment stretched, hope thrumming in her veins. Then Drogon bared his teeth. The sound that tore from his throat was a cacophony of anger. He spewed a torrent of flame toward the ballista teams. Men shouted in terror, diving to the ground. Fire washed over the wagons and ignited the bolts. One wagon exploded in a burst of flame. Men shrieked as they tried to roll away from the inferno. Screams filled the night. "Fire!" Grey Worm commanded. The remaining ballista teams let loose. The first harpoon soared wide, disappearing into the sky. Another lodged into Drogon's flank, making him shriek with rage. Daenerys watched in horror, torn between wanting to subdue him and the agony of seeing him wounded. Drogon twisted, snapping at the embedded harpoon. A second bolt caught his wing membrane, ripping a hole in the leathery expanse. The dragon bellowed in pain, thrashing violently. "Hold your fire!" Daenerys shouted, but it was too late. Another volley erupted. One bolt scored along Drogon's scales, leaving a scratch but not penetrating. A second harpoon tangled in the first, causing it to dislodge. Drogon wheeled around, launching another fountain of flame that ripped across the wagons. Soldiers scattered, weapons clattering. Daenerys's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing her. She managed to keep her seat, but her stomach lurched as she saw men set ablaze, rolling on the ground in futile attempts to extinguish dragonfire. "Drogon!" she cried again. This time, the dragon turned toward her. She locked eyes with him, seeing only a bestial fury. For a moment, she thought he might recognize her presence. She remembered how he had once come to her aid in Meereen, how that bond had felt like destiny itself. but the savage glare in his eyes banished all illusions. Drogon released a short, violent burst of flame that enveloped the space between them. Daenerys's horse shrieked, and she flung herself from the saddle as it collapsed in a heap of burning flesh. The intense heat singed her hair. She felt the scalding pain on her cheek. Rolling across the ground, she scrambled behind a boulder, trying to catch her breath, heart pounding like a war drum. She heard Grey Worm shouting orders. The clang of spears, the clatter of men scrambling. A fresh volley of ballista bolts soared into the sky. One found its mark, striking Drogon's hind leg. The dragon roared and whipped his tail, smashing one of the wagons to splinters. Daenerys peered over the rock, tears streaming from her eyes. She had led her men into a nightmare. Bodies littered the ground, some on fire, some torn apart. The air stank of blood, smoke, and burning flesh. With a furious roar, Drogon beat his wings, lifting off the ground in a fury of dust. He hovered for a heartbeat, fire illuminating his jaws, then unleashed another barrage upon the men below. Daenerys pressed herself against the boulder, the heat washing over her. She bit her lip until she tasted blood. She had to do something or all would be lost. Forcing herself to her feet, she skirted around the boulder, ignoring the searing pain in her side where she had landed. She could see Grey Worm struggling to rally the surviving Unsullied. A handful of archers fired arrows that glanced harmlessly off Drogon's armor-like hide. Another harpoon soared, this one striking the dragon's side but failing to penetrate deeply. Drogon's enraged shriek shook the air. She sprinted through the chaos, debris crunching underfoot. A swirl of smoke half-blinded her, but she glimpsed the silhouette of Yora near a smashed ballista, trying to coax the few remaining men into one final shot. She called his name, voice hoarse. He spotted her, relief and alarm flooding his face. "Daenerys, get down!" A rush of fire swept across the position where he stood, forcing him and the men to throw themselves flat. Daenerys skidded behind the ruins of another wagon, chest tight. Panic threatened to consume her. She had never been so close to Drogon's unleashed fury, never been so helpless to calm him. But she was not entirely helpless. She was blood of the dragon. Perhaps that meant something even now. Summoning all her courage, she stepped out from cover, ignoring Yora's frantic shout. She raised her arms wide and screamed in High Valyrian, "Dracarys!" The word echoed, though it made little sense to command him to breathe fire when that was the very thing she feared. But it was the only word that came to her lips, a reminder of their bond, the first word she'd ever spoken to coax his flames. Drogon whipped his head around, jaws dripping with smoking saliva. He hissed, tail lashing. In a single, heart-stopping moment, Drogon descended upon Daenerys. She saw every detail of his monstrous form, the ridges along his spine, the star-flecked darkness of his scales, the primal hatred in his eyes. She half expected to feel the lethal heat of dragonfire. Instead, he lunged with jaws snapping. She threw herself to the ground, and his claws grazed her shoulder, tearing through her armor. She cried out, rolling away. The pain ripped through her, but she forced herself to stand again, dizzy with terror. Behind them, a surviving ballista crew seized the opportunity. Their bolt hurtled through the sky, catching Drogon just behind his neck. He let out a horrifying shriek, thrashing in agony. Blood spattered across the ground, black as pitch. Daenerys stared, chest heaving, tears coursing down her face. Drogon swung his massive head, unleashing a gout of flame that instant. Erat the ballista crew. Screams died instantly, replaced by a wave of inhuman heat. With a final heave, Drogon tore the bolt loose from his flesh, a stream of dark blood oozing down his scales. He turned his head skyward and let out a thunderous roar, then flapped his wings, stirring a maelstrom of dust and embers. He rose into the air, the ground trembling under the force of his ascent, and soared into the night, leaving devastation below. Silence crashed over the battlefield like a hammer. Only the crackling of fires and the groans of the dying broke it. Daenerys collapsed to her knees, her shoulder screaming in pain, blood trickling down her arm. She stared at the black sky. Drogon was gone. She had failed to calm him, failed to subdue him, and now countless men lay dead. The scalding guilt was almost more than she could bear. Grey Worm staggered over, blood running down his face from a gash on his brow. "Your Grace," he murmured, sinking to one knee. "We must see to the wounded." She nodded numbly, unable to speak. Jorah limped toward her, face streaked with soot. He gently placed a hand on her uninjured shoulder. "You're hurt," he said softly. She shook her head. She could barely feel the pain in her body. It was nothing compared to the agony in her heart. The dawn found them still counting the dead. Half the ballistae were destroyed, and more than a third of the men who had marched with her lay in smoldering heaps. Others were grievously wounded. The few survivors worked in a grim hush, burying the bodies, extinguishing lingering fires, and tending to the dying with minimal supplies. Daenerys moved among them like a ghost, tears drying on her cheeks. She knelt by a young Unsullied who had lost both legs to dragonfire. He stared at her with wide, empty eyes, then slumped in death before she could offer a word. As the sun climbed higher, Jorah approached once more, weaving between broken wagons. "Khaleesi, we can't stay here. The men are too demoralized. We must head back to Meereen before Drogon returns. Or we'll be finished." She stared at the horizon, where the sky blazed gold. "We have accomplished nothing," she said, voice hollow. "We only proved we can wound him, and in doing so, we lost so many lives." Jorah's shoulders sagged. "We tried," he said. "Sometimes it's all we can do." For a moment, a hot rush of anger roared inside Daenerys. She wanted to scream that trying was not enough, that this world demanded she succeed or die. But she saw no point in venting at Jorah. He was as heartsick as she was. She nodded weakly. "Then we go back." They formed a meager column of survivors. Grey Worm had enough men to carry the worst of the wounded on makeshift stretchers. Daenerys insisted on walking, clutching her injured shoulder. Each step felt like a condemnation. She dreaded returning to Meereen, to face the stares of her people when they learned how the mission ended. The journey back was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Days stretched out across a scorched desert. Night after night, they camped among shattered illusions. Daenerys' sleep was plagued by nightmares, of Drogon's eyes glaring at her through a haze of flame, of the roars echoing with betrayal. More than once she woke gasping for air, only to remember the waking world was little better than her dreams. At last, the walls of Meereen appeared on the horizon. Smoke from the city's forges rose in thin pillars, a homely sight she once found comforting. Now it reminded her of the fires that devoured all hope. The gates opened for her ragged force. She expected people to cheer her return, but the streets were eerily quiet. Word must have traveled of the defeat. Faces peeked from shutters and doorways, eyes filled with apprehension. They recognized her sorrowful procession, the wounded men, the drooping banners. Some turned away, reluctant to see their queen brought so low. Inside the Great Pyramid, Daenerys sank onto her throne with little ceremony, her body trembling from fatigue. Missandei rushed to her side, tears glistening. "You're hurt!" she exclaimed, noticing the blood-stained bandage on Daenerys' shoulder. "I'll fetch the healers at once." Daenerys made no argument. She felt barely conscious. While Missandei ran for aid, Jorah and Grey Worm stood before the throne, shoulders slumped. She lifted her gaze to them, voice scratching in her throat. "Tell me, the city?" Grey Worm spoke quietly. "No direct dragon attacks, Your Grace, but the people are uneasy. Many have fled for the countryside, ironically where Drogon roams, believing they'll take their chances away from your rule." She let out a bitter laugh. "They're fleeing the queen because of the dragon's menace. Yet out there, Drogon burns villages." Her laughter turned into a sob. She pressed a hand to her eyes. "Gods, what have I done?" No one had an answer, and an interminable silence followed. Missandei soon returned with 2 healers, who gently helped Daenerys to her chambers. She barely registered their ministrations, lost in a haze of grief and exhaustion. Once the wound was cleaned and stitched, they left her to sleep, pressing a potion into her hands that promised dreamless rest. She slept fitfully, haunted by visions. A towering dragon of black wings loomed over her, hissing her name. When she reached out, the dragon turned away, leaving her adrift in a swirl of ash. The next morning, she awoke to find the city in turmoil once again. Missandei entered, face ashen, and said, "Your Grace, there's unrest in the streets. Groups of freedmen and sellswords are marching, demanding answers about Drogon. Some blame you. Some demand you take more drastic measures. Others want to flee to Pentos or beyond. There have been scuffles." Daenerys forced herself out of bed, wincing at the pain. She dressed in a simple tunic, ignoring the ceremonial gowns. "Then we face them," she said. "I will not hide." She went down to the courtyard, where a large crowd had gathered. As soon as she appeared, a cacophony of voices erupted. Some called her Mysa, pleading for salvation from Drogon's depredations. Others shouted accusations, cursing her for unleashing the beast. Daenerys lifted her arms for silence. Slowly, the clamor subsided to a low rumble. "I know your fears," she began, her voice projecting as best she could manage. "I know Drogon has caused immeasurable suffering. Believe me when I say I share your anguish. I tried to subdue him, and many brave soldiers fell in the attempt. I do not take this lightly. We will continue to seek a solution. But to those who wish to leave, know that you are free to do so. I will not keep prisoners. To those who wish to stay, I vow to defend you with all the power I possess." Her words only half calmed the crowd. Angry murmurs persisted, and Daenerys felt the sting of each. Missandei touched her arm gently, urging her to retreat before tempers boiled over. She consented, letting the Unsullied hold the crowd at bay. Days bled into weeks, and Meereen felt like a city under siege. Not by an external army, but by the lurking threat of Drogon. Reports trickled in of his attacks far to the west. Some said slavers tried to capture him, only to be burned alive. Others told wild rumors of Drogon amassing a brood in the distant mountains. Daenerys dismissed that as impossible, but the mere suggestion brought fresh waves of panic. Trading caravans dared not pass near Meereen, cutting off vital commerce. Tension roiled among the freedmen, who worried about food shortages. Daenerys convened her council one final time. She stared at the worn faces around the table: Grey Worm, Yora, Missandei, a handful of city leaders. "I've considered every possibility," she said quietly. "We cannot kill Drogon without losing the last symbol of House Targaryen and dooming this city to the idea that I have been defeated. Yet we cannot leave him to ravage the land. Something must be done." One of the city leaders, a freedman named Rod, spoke with trembling composure. "Your Grace, might it be best if you abdicate? Withdraw to some other place. Let the city find its own way to defend itself against the dragon. You have given us freedom. Perhaps the time has come for us to rule ourselves." An uncomfortable hush followed. Daenerys's eyes flicked to Grey Worm, who looked at Rod as though he might impale him for his audacity. But Daenerys was too exhausted to feel anger. She simply felt hollow. "And what of my destiny?" she asked softly. "What of Westeros, the Iron Throne?" Rod lowered his gaze. "We are not Westeros, Your Grace. We are Meereen, and perhaps we no longer wish to be defined by dragons and Targaryens." A momentary flicker of defiance shone in Daenerys's eyes. Then it faded. "I see," she said. She looked at Yora, who wore a pained expression. "Is this what you advise?" He hesitated, caught between loyalty and realism. Finally, he said, "It may be safer for you for the city, but I will follow you wherever you go." Grey Worm's voice rang with quiet steel. "I and the Unsullied are yours. We will fight for you until the end." Daenerys closed her eyes. The weight of it all bore down on her. Drogon's rampage, the people's fear, her crumbling dream. A memory of her brother Viserys' words flickered in her mind. "We are the blood of the dragon." But what good was that legacy if the dragon was lost? Slowly, she opened her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "I will go," she said, her voice subdued but resolute. "Not because I abandon you, but because this city deserves peace. If I remain, Drogon's wrath will forever be tied to my name, and my presence only sows fear in your hearts." She paused, meeting the gazes of those around her. "You are free. Rule yourselves or choose another leader, but I will take the remains of my forces and depart. If Drogon follows me, then perhaps Meereen will be spared." Shock rippled through the room. Rod blinked, uncertain whether to cheer or mourn. Missandei's eyes brimmed with tears. She clasped Daenerys' hand. "My queen," she whispered, heartbreak evident in her tone. Daenerys tightened her grip. "Come with me if you wish, or remain to help the people. I will not command your choice." Missandei swallowed. "I serve you, always." Daenerys gave a small nod, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Then prepare. We leave in 3 days." She looked at Grey Worm. "You and the Unsullied may do as you will. I cannot ask you to follow me into exile." He bowed. "We followed you as slaves. We follow you as free men, if you will have us." She managed a sad smile. "Thank you, but remember that some must remain to keep order in Meereen. Pick who will stay, who will come, as you see fit." With that, the council dispersed in a hushed, somber haze. Daenerys remained in the chamber, staring at the map of Essos that she had once laid out with such ambition. Her gaze drifted toward the western edges, beyond Slaver's Bay, across the Dothraki Sea, perhaps even across the narrow sea to Westeros. That was the dream that once guided her. Now she felt only the sting of defeat. Exile? The word tasted bitter on her tongue. Yet it might be her only path to preserve whatever scraps of dignity and hope remained. 3 days later, at dawn, Daenerys assembled her loyal retinue in the courtyard. The Unsullied who chose to follow her stood in ranks, though their numbers were painfully reduced. The city's population turned out to watch. Many gazed silently, unsure whether to celebrate the departure of the mother of a destructive dragon or to mourn the departure of the liberator who freed them from chains. Daenerys said nothing as she mounted a sturdy chestnut horse. Her shoulder still hurt, but the wound was healing. Missandei rode at her side, tearful but resolute. Jorah guided his own horse, steadfast in his devotion. As they rode through the gates, Daenerys looked back at the towering walls and the Great Pyramid. Once she had stood atop that pyramid and felt like a queen. Now she was a wandering exile in a land that had rejected her. She turned away, urging her horse forward into an uncertain future. Whispers flitted through the crowd. Where will she go? What of Drogon? No one had answers, least of all Daenerys herself. They traveled east, away from the immediate path of Drogon's destruction, hoping to draw him in pursuit if he still hunted her. But the sky remained empty. Days turned to weeks as they skirted the fringes of the Dothraki Sea. Neither sign nor rumor of Drogon reached them. Mercenaries or bandits occasionally tested their small column, but the Unsullied swiftly dispatched any threats. The exiled queen spent long nights staring at the stars, recalling prophecies of the prince that was promised, the forging of kings in Dragonfire, the legacy she had been so sure was hers. Now she questioned everything. Had she misunderstood the signs? Had she overestimated her bond with Drogon? Night after night, she found no answers in the silent tapestry of the heavens. Months wore on. They crossed deserts and plains, aiming for the relative safety of an unaligned port city. Rumors reached them of Meereen's new government, led by a council of freedmen and local merchants. Some said the city was recovering, forging its own path without the Targaryen queen. Drogon still appeared here and there, a wrathful shadow in the western skies, though he seemed to leave Meereen alone. For Daenerys, the news was a bitter solace. At least the people she once ruled might find peace. But each rumor of Drogon's rampages cut her anew, a reminder of the creature she had birthed and lost. As the heat of day abated in a barren campsite, Yora approached her. She sat on a small rock, gazing at the horizon where lightning flickered in distant clouds. "Khaleesi," he said softly, "we'll reach Qohor in a week's time if the weather holds. The men are tired, but they remain loyal. We can find refuge there, perhaps a new beginning." She nodded, eyes distant. "A new beginning," she repeated, tasting the words. "I am not sure I know what that means anymore." He knelt beside her, the warm glow of the dying sun illuminating the scars on his arms. "We've both lost much, but sometimes new beginnings come when we least expect them. You still have your name, your claim. Westeros remains, and so does the possibility of a future. You are Daenerys Targaryen. You survived the pyre once. Perhaps you shall again." She closed her eyes, remembering the flames that had once given her life rather than taken it. "I am alive, yes," she murmured, "but the world I sought to create lies behind me, in ashes." A faint tear slid down her cheek. Drogon was the key to so much. Now he is a nightmare unleashed. Yora placed a gentle hand over hers. "Then let us find another path," he said. "If we must face him again, we will. If not, we'll forge on. Wherever you go, I will follow." She exhaled, a shaky breath on the verge of sobbing, but she steadied herself. Beneath the swirl of sorrow, a small flame of resolve still burned. She had been broken before, by the death of her child, by betrayal and war. Yet she lived. A Targaryen does not die so easily. As night fully fell, Daenerys rose to her feet, gazing at the flickering stars overhead. "We go on, then," she said quietly, voice carrying just enough strength for Yora to hear. "And if the gods are kind, one day, I will find a way to mend what I have broken. Or at least ensure that the Dragon Queen does not remain powerless forever." No fanfare accompanied her words. No triumphant music or kneeling subjects. Only the hush of the desert wind and the distant rumble of thunder. But Daenerys Targaryen had chosen to continue her story, even if it was no longer the glorious saga she once believed in. She turned toward the small encampment of her loyal followers. Missandei sitting by the fire, Grey Worm inspecting weapons, the Unsullied posted as sentinels. They all waited for her command. And so the Mother of Dragons walked into the darkness, wounded yet unbroken, exiled from the city she had freed, abandoned by the beast she had loved. Somewhere in the vast expanse of Essos, Drogon soared on savage wings, his roars echoing across scorched fields. But Daenerys kept moving forward, footstep by footstep, carrying the memory of dragons within her. No matter how powerless she felt in that moment, she remained a Targaryen, and the seeds of fire burned in her blood. And though her heart ached with each new dawn, she would never forget who she was and what she still might become. Daenerys Targaryen listened to the wind whistle across the endless plains as her small retinue set up camp. The grass of the Dothraki Sea stretched out in rolling waves all around, silvered by the moonlight. In her bones, she still felt the ache of her healing wounds, the aftershocks of dragonfire that had come so close to ending her life. She wanted to believe time would dull that pain, but every morning brought fresh memories of Drogon's fury. As she knelt to tie the flaps of her tent, she let her fingers linger on the rough canvas and tried to push away the images of black wings and molten eyes. Each day without her dragon weighed on her in ways she could scarcely articulate, a hollowness beneath her ribs that no amount of breath could fill. They had traveled many leagues east of Meereen, away from the worst of Drogon's rampages. For the first time in years, Daenerys knew what it was to feel truly aimless. The city she had freed had effectively cast her out, or she had cast herself out to spare it further destruction. The knowledge that her departure might save innocent lives was cold comfort. She could not dismiss how it felt to walk away from everything she had built. Her biggest fear was that, even now, Drogon might still decide to circle back and unleash more devastation on Meereen for reasons only a dragon could comprehend. But rumor and scattered reports suggested he was roaming the west, circling the fringes of her once-held territory, perhaps drawn there by older hunting grounds or by the smell of war. As she finished tying her tent flaps, she heard the soft footsteps of Missandei approaching. Even on grass, Missandei's light tread was distinctive to Daenerys, who glanced over her shoulder. By the orange glow of the torches staked around the camp, Daenerys saw the worry etched into Missandei's features. A year ago, had it truly been only a year? Missandei's face had been more open, carrying a hopeful light whenever she looked upon her queen. Now that light was tinged with sorrow. "Your Grace," Missandei said softly, as though raising her voice might shatter what remained of Daenerys's composure. "The men are asking when we will reach Qohor." Daenerys looked to the north, where the horizon fused sky and land into an indistinct line. "We'll make Qohor soon enough," she murmured. "If the weather holds and there are no delays, perhaps another week or two. Yora believes we can find some measure of safety there." Missandei lowered her gaze, nodding. "We have not taken the main roads, so our journey has been slow, but there have been no fresh sightings of Drogon. The men, well, they're uneasy, but they're relieved there hasn't been another attack." Daenerys could almost feel the question balancing on Missandei's lips, whether Daenerys wished Drogon would appear. A twisted part of her desired to see him, if only to convince herself the bond might still be repaired. Another part of her dreaded the thought, fearing any encounter might end in further bloodshed. Pressing her lips together, Daenerys rose from her crouch and turned to face her friend. "We'll keep going," she said. "Have Grey Worm maintain a watch. If any Khalasar roams near, we must be REA. Dysprosium. The Dothraki Sea is rarely empty of riders." Missandei's brow furrowed. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, and then, lowering her voice, she stepped a little closer. "Have you eaten?" Daenerys inhaled, realizing how hollow her stomach felt, how the dryness in her throat caught each time she tried to speak. She had been so lost in thought that mealtime had passed without her notice. "Not yet," she managed. "I'll eat, I promise. Go on." Missandei bowed her head, then withdrew. Daenerys let the torches guide her back into the heart of the camp, where the Unsullied who had chosen exile with her were setting up ranks of small tents with quiet efficiency. Unlike her older campaigns, when she had marched with thousands, she now traveled with only a few hundred devoted soldiers, a pitiful fraction of the storied might that once toppled Yunkai and Astapor. Yet their discipline remained unshakable. They had chosen her freely, refusing to abandon their queen. That knowledge was both a comfort and a source of gnawing guilt. She had already lost so many to Drogon's flames. How many more might perish in her name? She caught sight of Grey Worm standing at the perimeter, conferring with two Unsullied sergeants. A bandage still wrapped part of his upper arm from the last confrontation with Drogon, but his posture betrayed no weakness. Daenerys remembered when he was newly anointed as commander of her forces, how he spoke so little but led by example, how unwavering he had been in his loyalty. Now he was stoic to a fault, but she saw a heaviness in his eyes that had not been there before. She approached him, and the sergeants saluted wordlessly, stepping aside. Grey Worm dipped his head. "Your Grace, all patrols are set." "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. She had grown so weary of formalities, of reminding herself that she was still a queen in the eyes of her men. "Have there been any signs? Riders or footprints? Smoke on the horizon?" Grey Worm shook his head. "We encountered an abandoned Dothraki encampment several miles back, but it seemed days old. No fresh tracks, no sign of dragons." Daenerys's mouth tightened. "Good," she said, though she wasn't sure if she truly meant it. "Ensure the men rest. Tomorrow we press on at first light." He glanced at her injured shoulder. Though healing, it still bore the faint marks of gouging claws and the constant ache beneath the newly knitted skin. "Your Grace," he said hesitantly, voice low. "You should sleep as well." She waved a dismissive hand. "Soon," she replied. "When I can." He nodded, then signaled to his sergeants and withdrew. Daenerys lingered, letting the night air wash over her face. She tipped her head back, gazing at the stars. In another life, she might have stood on a ship bound for Westeros by now, dragon triumphant at her side, armies ready to conquer the Seven Kingdoms. Instead, she wandered Essos as though she had never left Pentos all those years ago. Once, all she wanted was to cross the narrow sea and reclaim the Iron Throne. But everything seemed overshadowed by her failure to keep Drogon's allegiance. Would House Targaryen's last living dragon be her undoing? Eventually, she forced herself to return to her tent. Yora awaited her there, standing near a makeshift table. He looked up when she entered, worry etched in the lines of his face. She remembered how she had exiled him once for betrayal, how he had returned, how their relationship had grown complicated by loyalty, love, regret. Now, in her darkest times, he stood by her side without question. He gestured to a bowl of stew that one of the camp cooks had prepared. "Eat, Khaleesi," he said, using the old Dothraki title she had once worn proudly. "You'll need your strength. We're heading into uncertain territory." She grimaced but took the bowl. The stew smelled of lentils and meager spices, hardly the fare of a conquering queen. She swallowed a spoonful, tasting blandness and feeling no real appetite, but she knew her body demanded sustenance. "Any new tidings?" she asked between forced bites. "Rumors from passing travelers," he said. "They claim that a few warlords in the west attempt to fight back against Drogon's depredations. Others speak of entire villages traveling en masse to the coast, hoping to sail away and escape. But the sellswords who remain say Drogon's presence makes it difficult for any merchant caravan to move safely." She chewed her stew slowly, the lumps of beans turning to paste in her mouth. "And what of Meereen?" she asked. "I've heard conflicting stories," Yora replied. "Some say the city's new council is fractious and might lead to fresh chaos. Others claim they've found a workable peace. No sign Drogon has returned there, though. Meereen seems spared." She nodded, trying not to let bitterness seep into her voice. "At least I spared them that," she whispered. "Have you spoken to Missandei tonight?" He nodded. "She's checking on the men as usual. She wanted to ensure the wounded have enough salves and bandages. She's worried about you." Daenerys set her spoon down, half the stew still untouched. She could feel Yora's gaze. "She's not alone," she said wryly. "I can see it in everyone's eyes." He took a step forward, bracing his hands on the table. "You are their hope," he said, voice hushed but intense. "Even now, after everything that's happened, they believe in you. You gave them freedom, you gave them purpose. No man or dragon can erase that." She stared at him, wanting to believe. For years, she had stoked the fires of her confidence with the knowledge that she was meant to be a queen. The prophecy, the comet, the dragon's birth, they had seemed to confirm her destiny. But destiny felt fragile now, crumbling under the weight of catastrophic reality. "Maybe I should have stayed in Meereen," she murmured, "even if it meant facing Drogon again." "You would have risked the entire city," Yora reminded her gently. "We both saw the devastation he caused when he turned on us. Meereen needed to learn to stand without your hand on the reins. You did what you had to do." She lowered her gaze, a knot tightening in her chest. "I keep telling myself that, but I feel as though I've abandoned them, abandoned everything. And still, Drogon's out there." A heavy silence settled. Yora wanted to say something reassuring, but the truth was plain. Daenerys had lost her dragon, and the world had lost faith in the myth that Targaryens held unbreakable bonds with their winged children. In some old texts, there were stories of dragons turning on riders, but rarely in such a spectacular, sustained way. Usually, a Targaryen had a chance to reforge the bond, or else the beast was taken down by the might of King's Landing. This was different. This was raw betrayal, spread across the wide expanse of Essos, leaving Daenerys as an exile queen. She pushed aside the stew, appetite spent. "Let's rest," she said. "We ride with the sunrise. Another day closer to Qohor, to something." Yora let out a slow breath and gave a shallow bow. "As you command. I'll be nearby if you need me, Khaleesi." He exited the tent, leaving Daenerys alone with the lantern's flickering glow. She slipped off her boots, wincing at the memory of how she used to sleep on silk in the Great Pyramid. Now, a thin pallet on the ground was her bed. Biting back any resentment, she lay down, crossing her arms beneath her head. Sleep would not come easily, she knew. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Drogon's roar or felt the lick of flames on her cheek. After hours of tossing, she drifted into a light, uneasy slumber. When dawn broke, they continued east, pushing through the grasslands. The Dothraki Sea was not truly a sea, but the endless horizon of swaying grass gave the illusion of water, especially under the shifting light. Daenerys remembered how she had once crossed this expanse as a frightened girl, married to Khal Drogo. She had become Khaleesi, then Mother of Dragons. She had walked into the flames of Drogo's funeral pyre and emerged unburnt, with 3 new-hatched dragons at her side. Now she returned in a state of humiliating loss. By midday, clouds scudded across the sky, and a stiff wind tugged at the group's cloaks. They paused near a shallow creek to let the horses drink. Daenerys dismounted and stretched her sore muscles, rotating her shoulder gingerly. The wound itched beneath its bandage. She surveyed the land, scanning for any sign of riders or black wings in the distance. Nothing. A sudden commotion made her turn. One of the scouts returned in a hurry, urging his horse into a trot. He swung down, chest heaving. "Grey Worm," he called. "Your Grace." Then he addressed them both, voice urgent. "Khalasar to the south. Perhaps 200 riders. They seem to be moving this way." Grey Worm set his jaw, turning to Daenerys. "We cannot outrun them if they choose to meet us. The Unsullied will form a defensive line if needed." Daenerys felt a tingle of worry. She and her small band were in no shape to battle a Dothraki horde, even a smaller one. On the other hand, she was still Daenerys Stormborn, Khaleesi to some Mother of Dragons, even if her dragon had abandoned her. Some Dothraki might respect that, or at least remember her name. "We'll wait," she said. "We do not want to provoke them. Let them come if they must." Grey Worm passed the order to the men, who set aside their canteens and readied their spears. The mood turned tense. Daenerys mounted her horse once more, ignoring the flutter of pain as she lifted herself into the saddle. Yora trotted to her side, face grim. "We may have an opportunity," he said quietly. "Dothraki respect strength, but they also remember your past. Some might have heard tales of how you birthed dragons. If they see you cowering, they'll sense weakness." Daenerys allowed herself a bitter smile. "Then I will not cower," she said. "Let them see me as I am." They waited in uneasy silence, scanning the southern horizon. The sun crawled overhead, relentless in its glare. At last, a dust cloud signaled approaching riders. Daenerys pulled back on her reins, tensing. Soon, the thunder of hooves resonated across the plain, and a wedge of Dothraki riders emerged from the haze. She recognized the standard they carried, a stylized horse's head, the sigil of some lesser call. When the riders drew closer, they slowed, fanning out in a cautious semicircle. They wore the familiar leather vests, long hair bound in braids. Each rider had at least one arak strapped to his side, if not a pair. Daenerys nudged her horse forward. Grey Worm moved with her, spear at the ready, while Yora flanked her other side. They halted a short distance from the front ranks of the Khalasar. Daenerys lifted her chin, letting her silver hair catch the wind. From the mass of riders emerged a man in his middle years, hair braided down his back, face weathered by the sun. His arak hung at his hip, but he held it loosely, not brandishing it. He observed Daenerys intently, as if struggling to decide if she was truly the woman from the tales. "I am Khal Tamo," he declared in the Dothraki tongue, voice carrying across the air. "I have heard rumors of a silver-haired Khaleesi who once walked into fire and brought forth dragons. Yet I see no dragons here." Daenerys felt Yora shift beside her, but she kept her gaze locked on Khal Tamo. She responded in fluent Dothraki, her voice level. "I am Daenerys Targaryen, the Unburnt, once Khaleesi to Khal Drogo. I birthed dragons, yes, but the largest of them has turned from me." A murmur swept through the Khalasar. Some of the riders exchanged glances. Daenerys knew that the Dothraki admired strong, straightforward leaders. A sign of weakness could spur them to test her. She steadied herself, ignoring her own misgivings. Khal Tamo flicked his eyes over the unsullied ranks. You travel with warriors, yet you are few. What brings you back to the Dothraki Sea? Daenerys took a moment before answering. I travel east, seeking new fortunes. My past lies behind me. Tamo's features remained inscrutable. And your dragon? The black beast that hunts men across the west. I have no control over him now, Daenerys admitted. She forced her voice not to quiver. He is free, a law unto himself. A thin smile curved across the Khal's lips. A Khaleesi who lost her dragon? That is a tale fit for the fires. He paused, eyes narrowing. You say you were Khal Drogo's Khaleesi. He was a mighty Khal. Some still recall the rumor that you killed a Magi in the fire to birth your dragons. That you rose unburnt. Daenerys inclined her head. All is true. Khal Drogo was my sun and stars, and I was his Khaleesi. The Dothraki who once followed me saw my dragon with their own eyes. They shouted my name across V's Dothrak. She wondered if Tamo had knowledge of those events, or if he was too far removed from the old circles of Drogo's Khalasar. His expression remained impassive. Then he turned to look at the Unsullied, scanning their disciplined ranks. We have seen others from beyond the narrow sea come to our grasslands, but not with so many spears. Usually they keep to the coast. Why journey into the heart of the Dothraki Sea unless you seek allies? Or to run from something? We run from nothing, Daenerys said. But I do not deny that we must pass through. I would prefer to do so without bloodshed. We have no quarrel with you. Tamo stroked the braids of his mustache, eyes flicking around. His men shifted uneasily, a rocks rattling. A Khal who does not challenge a trespasser is no Khal, he said, though he did not brandish his steel. Yet I have heard enough tales to know you are not just any trespasser. Perhaps I should see for myself if the unburnt still burns. Daenerys's heart pounded. She sensed a challenge brewing in his words. The Dothraki were prone to testing strangers, especially strangers who claimed legendary feats. She tried to calm her breathing. If Tamo demanded a show of strength, how could she comply without a dragon at her beck? And yet she could not show fear. She had learned that lesson in Drogo's time. She nodded slowly. What do you propose? Tamo gave a small, cunning smile. A test. A small one. You claim the flames do not harm you, that you walked unburnt from the pyre. Let me see it with my own eyes. A hush descended over the Unsullied and the Dothraki riders. Even Yora looked alarmed, though he tried to keep his face neutral. Daenerys remembered how unpredictable the flames had been. The night she birthed her dragons had been a moment of sorcery, prophecy, and raw magic. It was not a stunt she could casually repeat. Yet these men had grown up believing in strength over all else. She knew if she refused, Tamo might see it as a sign of cowardice. If she somehow proved the rumor, perhaps that alone would grant them passage. She lifted her chin, controlling the tremor in her voice. I do not court death for entertainment, Khal Tamo, but I will show you I have no fear of fire. She gestured to a patch of open ground. Have your men build a small blaze. A ripple of surprise passed through both sides. Missandei shifted in her saddle farther back, genuine worry etched on her face. Daenerys could almost hear her friend's silent protest. We don't know if the flames will still spare you. But Daenerys had no time to flinch. This was a matter of survival. The memory of the pyre that had birthed Drogon guided her still. Khal Tamo barked an order in Dothraki. Some riders dismounted, gathering dry grass and wood from their packs. In short order, they constructed a crude bonfire in the middle of the plain. A half-dozen Unsullied stood guard, uncertain whether to intervene. Daenerys dismounted, passing her reins to Yora. She felt his hand on hers, briefly, a silent question. She nodded, pulling away gently. The Dothraki lit the fire. Flames crackled and danced, sending up a swirl of sparks. The grass was so dry that the heat flared quickly. Daenerys watched it spread, heart pounding. She recalled the sensations of that night long ago. How the flames had consumed Mirri Maz Duur's screams. How she had felt an uncanny warmth but not the agony of burning flesh. how she had emerged with 3 small dragons clinging to her. She did not know if that gift still remained. She had stepped into other flames since, though none so intense. She had not burned then, but this was different. Felt rash, dangerously uncertain. Still, she stepped forward, ignoring Yora's hushed warning. She paused at the edge of the blaze. Heat rolled off it in waves, and the scorching wind stung her face. She met Tamo's eyes, and in her best Dothraki, she said, "Watch closely." Daenerys took another step, and the flames licked at her boots. Pain flared. Her body tensed. She gritted her teeth, pressing forward. The fire enveloped her skirts, blazing up her legs. She held her breath, ignoring the instinct to recoil. She had to trust the old magic, trust her own blood. Another step. The cloth of her skirts caught fire in earnest, and she felt scorching heat rise around her waist. She bit her lip hard, expecting the stabbing pain of burns. But it was distant, muffled. She pressed deeper until she stood in the midst of the fire, tongues of flame dancing around her torso. Around her, the world flickered orange and red. Smoke seared her lungs. Her body prickled with intense heat, but it was nowhere near the agony that flesh should feel when burned. She forced herself to remain a moment longer, to let Tamo and his Khalasar witness the truth. Then, carefully, she stepped out the far side of the fire, letting the flames dance away from her. Her clothing was badly singed, blackened in places, and bits of ash drifted off her. But her skin, beneath the soot, was unburnt. Shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and fear, she turned to face Tamo. The Khal stared, wide-eyed, not quite believing what he had just seen. Daenerys's hair was scorched at the ends, but her flesh was unscathed, save for minor reddening. Grey Worm and the Unsullied looked on in silent awe, remembering that night in Meereen when she had waded through a smaller fire to prove her might to the gathering crowd. Yora released a slow breath. Missandei pressed a hand over her mouth, relief mingling with astonishment. At last, Tamo spoke, his voice hushed with something like reverence. "You truly are the unburnt," he said. "The stories did not lie." Daenerys let out a soft, shaking breath. Her heart hammered so loudly she wondered if the entire plain could hear it. She forced a regal composure. "You have seen enough?" she asked, her tone steady despite the lingering tremors in her limbs. Tamo nodded, stepping forward and dropping to one knee, an act she had never seen from a Khal. He bowed his head. "We will not stand in your way, Daenerys Targaryen. You may pass through these grasslands. If you have need of horses or supplies, we can provide them. The Dothraki do not bow easily, but you have proven yourself as no mere mortal." A wave of surprise coursed through the onlookers. Dothraki men behind Tamo murmured among themselves, but none openly challenged his gesture. Daenerys felt a rush of relief. She was in no state to wage war against a Khal. Accepting his deference, she inclined her head. "Your offer is generous," she said. "We are in need of fresh horses. The journey to Qohor is still long." Tamo rose, gesturing to his men. "Then you shall have what we can spare. My blood riders will fetch them." Daenerys lifted a hand, calling Grey Worm forward. The stalwart, unsullied commander approached, glancing between her and Tamo. She addressed Tamo once more. "We will know. 'Tis stay long, but we welcome your aid. Perhaps, in time, the Dothraki will know I did not truly abandon my husband's Khalasar. My path simply led me elsewhere." Tamo's lips curved in a thin smile. "Those loyal to Khal Drogo's memory have scattered over the years, but some speak your name in awe. Now I have seen with my own eyes why they do." His gaze flicked to the smoldering embers of the fire. "A pity your black dragon is not here to witness your power. Perhaps he would remember you." Her heart twisted at the mention of Drogon. She nodded, forcing herself to maintain composure. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but that is a matter for another time." Tamo's men set to gathering half a dozen sturdy mounts, while the Unsullied offered them trade goods, some salted meat, small treasures from the baggage supply as a courtesy. The Dothraki accepted with casual interest, more intrigued by the existence of spear-wielding eunuchs who marched like machines. Once the exchange was complete, the two groups parted. Tomos Kalasar rode off, leaving Daenerys and her followers with new horses and no new enemies, at least for now. Once the Dothraki were gone, Daenerys allowed herself to slump slightly in the saddle. The aftershocks of adrenaline coursed through her, and her hands shook. She'd felt the flames devour her clothing. That old magic still protected her, but it had felt more tenuous than before, as if the bond that once tied her soul to Dragonfire had been weakened by the loss of Drogon. She remembered the night of the funeral pyre vividly, how it had been a moment of perfect, fated harmony. This was different, a forced demonstration, yet the outcome was real enough to cow even a call. Grey Worm and Missandei approached, both wearing similarly worried expressions. "Your Grace," Missandei whispered, "are you truly unharmed?" Daenerys nodded, though she felt as if her nerves were aflame. "My clothes fared worse," she said dryly, glancing at the scorched hem of her skirts. "But I remain unburnt." She flexed her hands, examining them. Only slight redness on the skin. No blistering, no charred flesh. Even so, a deeper ache pulsed in the old wound Drogon had left, as though reminding her that not all injuries were undone by magic. "Perhaps it is best you do not attempt that again," Yora interjected gently, coming up beside her. "It's remarkable, yes, but I fear each time you brave fire, you gamble with powers we barely understand." She closed her eyes, exhaling. "I had no choice." When she opened them, she saw the compassion in Yora's gaze. "Let's move on. I'd prefer not to linger, in case Tomo reconsiders his generosity." So they pressed eastward, this time accompanied by fresh horses for some of the foot soldiers, which lightened the load and allowed swifter travel. They spent the next days crossing rolling grasslands and the occasional rocky outcropping. Despite the intangible dread of traveling across the open plain, there was a strange sense of freedom as well. Daenerys found herself recalling older memories of riding at Drogo's side, hair streaming behind her. Back then, she had been a frightened bride, uncertain of her place in the world. Yet her life had seemed so much simpler than the complexities she now faced. On the fourth night following their encounter with Tomo, the wind turned chill, and the sky boiled with storm clouds. They made camp on a hill that offered a partial vantage over the surrounding terrain, hoping to see potential threats from any direction. Daenerys sat near a small fire that the Unsullied had erected, pressing her hands toward the flames. She felt no fear of these lesser flames, only a mild comfort in the warmth. Missandei handed her a thin blanket, and Daenerys draped it around her shoulders, noticing how the temperature had plummeted with the approach of the storm. Lightning flickered in the distance, revealing the swaying sea of grass for an instant, then plunging it back into darkness. Daenerys watched the horizon. Each flash of lightning made her think of black wings blotting out the sky. She wondered where Drogon roamed. Was he even now prowling the edges of some unfortunate settlement, or nursing his wounds in craggy mountains? She found herself startled when Grey Worm appeared at her side. He sank to a knee, ever the soldier. "Your Grace, a scout has returned," he said. "He reports seeing a cluster of caravans traveling west, perhaps from Qohor. They claim trouble stirs in the city." Daenerys's posture stiffened. What kind of trouble? Grey Worm's face revealed nothing. "He says they spoke of a plague sweeping through the outskirts, some sickness. Also rumors of a local warlord threatening to take advantage of the chaos. The travelers suggest Qohor may not be as safe a refuge as we hoped." Thunder rumbled overhead, and Daenerys felt the weight of the news press down on her. The illusions of stability kept slipping away from her grasp. "We've come so far," she said. "I had hoped Qohor would at least offer a place to gather ourselves. Now you say a plague runs rampant." Grey Worm nodded. "That is what the travelers claim. The scout says he heard mention of a fever that kills quickly. People are fleeing." Daenerys ran a hand across her forehead, the soft drizzle of rain beginning to patter the ground. Could they risk leading her small band into a plague-ridden city? Yet where else could they go? Her uncertain plan of heading to Qohor had hinged on the city's neutrality and rumored wealth. She wanted to regroup, perhaps find new ships to sail away from Slaver's Bay entirely. But if Qohor was compromised, turning north might lead them into haunted forests or uncharted territory, and turning south meant skirting lands that might hold more Dothraki or even bandit kings. She closed her eyes, feeling the hum of raindrops on the tents behind her. "For now, we continue," she said at last. "But we approach with caution. If the plague is dire, we'll reconsider." Grey Worm bowed and left to relay her orders. Daenerys gripped her blanket, listening to the low hiss of wind and the patter of rain turning more insistent. The small fire hissed and crackled under the droplets, sending up wavering tendrils of smoke. She thought back to Meereen, to her old throne room with braziers burning day and night, the scent of exotic oils, the clang of distant forges. She thought of how many times she had dreamed of a triumphant return to Westeros, riding Drogon across the sea while the bells of King's Landing tolled. Now all of it felt like a half-remembered fable. Jorah approached with a makeshift cloak draped over his shoulders. His hair was plastered to his brow from the drizzle, and his voice was soft. "The storm is worsening. We should seek shelter. Will you come inside?" She lifted her face toward the scudding clouds. Thunder rattled her ears. She gave a small nod and stood, wrapping the blanket tighter. Together, they retreated to her tent, where Missandei had already lit a lantern. A few of the Unsullied guarded the entrance, their spears angled toward the sky. Inside, the fabric walls flapped under the wind's assault. Daenerys sank onto a folded mat. Jorah stood, arms folded, while Missandei hovered in the corner, ever watchful. The swirling shadows cast by the lantern made the tent feel cramped and haunted. For a time, none of them spoke. They could hear the rain pelting the canvas, rising to a roar as the storm unleashed its fury. Finally, Daenerys broke the silence, her voice subdued. "It seems the entire world conspires to strip me of every certainty," she said. "Meereen in chaos, Drogon lost, Qohor in plague, and even my illusions that I might swiftly rebuild are crumbling under me. Sometimes I wonder if I should simply keep riding until I reach the edge of the known world and vanish." Missandei's eyes widened. "Your Grace, do not speak so. You are the breaker of chains. People look to you for hope." Daenerys gave a small, humorless laugh. "Yes, I remember the titles. And yet here I am, cowering in a tent from a thunderstorm, powerless against the plague that grips the city we aim for." She took a breath, mindful that her despair was contagious. She tried to muster some composure. "But you are right, Missandei. I have not come this far to vanish." Jorah shifted his weight. "If Qohor is truly diseased, we can skirt it. Perhaps the Red Temple in Volantis might offer some alternative." "Volantis," Daenerys repeated. She frowned, recalling the city's fervent devotion to Lawler, the Lord of Light. It was also a hotbed of political tension and slavery, though some reforms had begun. She had never fully conquered Volantis, but she had passed through once. The memory was muddled by so many other events. "It's far to the south, beyond this sea of grass. Months of travel. And they might not welcome me." "Perhaps not," Jorah said. "But the Red Priests are rumored to have mysterious powers. They speak of Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised all manner of prophecies. Some of them even hailed you as a savior once upon a time. If we're searching for answers about dragons, or a way to coax Drogon back, the Red Temple is one place that might offer insight." Daenerys mulled over that, the storm's roar filling the silence. The idea of consulting more mystics did not sit easily with her. She'd had enough of prophecies turning against her, from Mirri Maz Duur's illusions to the warnings of the warlocks in Qarth. But Jorah was right about one thing. If she still believed in her birthright and the power of magic that had once run through her veins, seeking answers from the Red Priests might be a better option than wandering aimlessly. Missandei cleared her throat, glancing at Daenerys. "Your Grace, if Qohor has a plague, turning south may be wisest, though it will be a longer road." Daenerys nodded slowly. "We'll decide once we see Qohor's outskirts with our own eyes," she said. If the situation is dire, we'll not linger. We'll head south for Volantis. But if by some chance the rumors are exaggerated, maybe we can find safe haven there." She let out a weary sigh. "Either way, we keep moving." As the storm raged into the night, the three of them continued to debate routes, resource needs, and potential alliances. Daenerys tried not to let hopelessness creep into her tone, but the labyrinth of unknowns pressed heavily on her. Still, she clung to the single thought: move forward, always move forward. If she had succumbed to despair after Drogo's death, she never would have hatched her dragons. If she had given up after Astapor, she never would have liberated Meereen. If she let go now, she would truly lose everything. In the gray hush of dawn, the storm finally relented. The camp woke to drenched grass, rivulets of water pooling in every shallow depression. The sun peeked through ragged clouds, promising a slow, humid day of travel. Daenerys emerged from her tent, blinking sleep from her eyes. She saw the Unsullied already dismantling the camp, shaking water off canvas and rolling up bedrolls. Missandei was speaking with a young soldier about the state of their provisions, while Yora was examining a map near a flat rock. Grey Worm approached, pointing to the southeast. "Riders again," he said. "Fewer than Tamo's group. Perhaps a small band of scouts." Daenerys followed his gaze, spotting the distant shapes of horses and men, about half a dozen, drawing closer. She frowned. Could it be stragglers from Tamo's Khalasar, or an entirely different group? She gestured for the men to be at the ready. As the riders neared, she saw that they were not Dothraki. Their attire looked more Westerosi, though their garments were dusty and travel-worn. Daenerys caught a flash of metal armor beneath threadbare cloaks. She urged her horse forward. The Unsullied parted to let her pass, forming a loose circle in case of trouble. The band of riders halted at a respectful distance. The man at their forefront removed his helm, revealing short brown hair and a weather-beaten face. He did not immediately draw a weapon. "Are you Daenerys Targaryen?" he called. Daenerys studied him with narrowed eyes. "I am," she answered. "Who are you, and what do you want with me?" The man inclined his head in a semblance of a bow. "My name is Savid. I'm sworn to no lord as of now, but I was once part of a mercenary company in the disputed lands. We heard rumors you had marched out of Meereen. We've been searching for you." A ripple of suspicion coursed through the Unsullied ranks. Yora rode up alongside Daenerys. "Searching for the queen? Why?" Savid's gaze flicked over Yora, then Daenerys. "We have information that might concern you. Word of an alliance forming in the west, near Lazer, possibly aimed at capturing or killing the black dragon that roams there. They're calling it the Dragonbane Alliance. Sells words, slavers' remnants, a few rogue lords. They blame the dragon's existence on you. They blame the ruin of their fortunes on your wars, and they mean to wipe out any trace of your reign. They say if they find you, they'll deliver you to your own dragon's flames. Poetic justice, they call it." Daenerys felt a chill. The idea of a coalition forming with the sole intent of destroying Drogon and possibly her was not surprising, given the chaos his rampages had caused, but it was still unnerving. She forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "And why would you share this with me?" Savid cleared his throat, looking at his companions. "We hold no love for slavers or for those who'd wage war without honor. Some of my men parted ways with a larger mercenary force that was conscripted into this alliance. When we heard the talk of capturing you, we decided we would rather warn you." He paused, glancing down at his reins. "And we hope, perhaps, you might remember us kindly in return. Many have prospered under your reign, your grace, even if times are dark now." Daenerys studied him closely. She could sense no overt deception in his voice, only a cautious sincerity. "What do you want from me, exactly?" He hesitated. "We'd like to join you if you'll have us. We are not many, but we're loyal swords. We believe you have a better claim to the future than any slaver scum." Grey Worm regarded the newcomers warily, but Daenerys held up a hand to forestall any objections. "You have my gratitude for this warning," she said. "We march east, away from Lazer, But if this Dragonbane alliance grows, it may spread across Essos. Are they truly so determined to kill Drogon? Savid nodded. They see the dragon as a threat to their holdings. They blame you for unleashing him. Some want to harness his power. Others say he must be slain. Rumor has it they've hired blacksmiths to fashion massive chains and harpoons. They're gathering alliances with local lords who fear the dragon's wrath on their lands. It's a formidable group. A knot of dread coiled in Daenerys' stomach. Drogon will not submit to them, she said, voice tight. They may wound him, corner him, but that would only make him more ferocious. The devastation could be immeasurable. Yora's gaze flicked to Daenerys, understanding the depth of her concern. Despite Drogon's betrayal, she did not truly want him destroyed, not only because he was her child in some sense, but because a cornered dragon could wreak ruin beyond imagining. Daenerys turned her attention to Savid's request. I will not turn away men who come in peace, but know that my path is uncertain. If you ride with me, you may find no wealth or victory at the end. Savid inclined his head. We understand, Your Grace. We ride with you regardless. Very well, Daenerys said, her voice carrying the echo of regal command she had once brandished in Meereen. Fall in with the others. Grey Worm will see you assigned and fed. But if any of you prove traitors, you'll answer to me. Grey Worm finished grimly, hand resting on his spear. Savid nodded, genuine relief showing on his face. He and his handful of companions guided their horses toward the edge of the encampment, where Unsullied began to direct them. Daenerys felt a wave of conflicting emotions. On one hand, these men brought dire news and the possibility of more open war. On the other hand, they offered fresh loyalty. She felt torn between hope and dread, as she had been for so long now. She turned to Yora and Missandei. This changes things, she said. If the Dragonbane alliance swells in power, they could chase Drogon across Essos. They might even threaten the cities I once liberated. She paused, chewing her lip. Should I ignore it and continue east, or attempt to intervene? Yora shrugged. We have too few men to launch any meaningful resistance, and to attempt to calm Drogon in the midst of a war might prove suicide. Missandei added, and if we fail or if Drogon refuses you again, we'd be caught between the dragon's wrath and the Alliance's armies. It's a frightening prospect. Daenerys nodded slowly, feeling the dread weigh on her. Still, she murmured, I cannot entirely abandon my legacy. If the Alliance manages to corner him, wounding or capturing him, the entire world might see that as the final blow to House Targaryen. My father's name was tarnished enough, but at least our lineage had the might of dragons in its blood. If Drogon falls to mercenaries and slavers' steel, House Targaryen's last vestige of power might be gone forever. A hush followed. Thunder still rumbled in the distance, though the sky was brighter than before. We do not have to decide now, Yora said gently. We continue to Qohor, if possible, and reassess. Perhaps we'll glean more information there. Daenerys accepted that, though uneasily. The thought of Drogon under siege gnawed at her mind. She recalled how she had once risked her life in the fighting pits of Meereen to protect him. Then, she had soared away on his back, a moment of sublime unity. Now, that bond was a memory overshadowed by flames turned against her. They resumed their march. The new arrivals fell in with the Unsullied, prompting whispered questions but no overt hostility. Savid seemed earnest, guiding his horse near the back and taking in the discipline of the eunuchs with subdued awe. Daenerys rode at the head of the column, pushing onward beneath a patchwork sky. Clouds drifted aside to reveal a glaring sun that dried the sodden grass, making the air thick with humidity. Days slid past in a grueling routine of early morning departures, midday stops for water, and late evening camp setups. Finally, after another long stretch, the grasslands began to give way to scattered copses of trees and flatter terrain. The outskirts of Qohor were renowned for their dark forests, but the group had yet to see the famous stands of towering pines. Instead, they encountered an unsettling emptiness. The roads were eerily quiet. The occasional traveler crossing paths with them spoke of plague and war, misery piling upon misery. In the evenings, Daenerys huddled with her advisors, gleaning every rumor they could find about Qohor. The city was known for its worship of the Black Goat, a fearsome deity requiring daily blood sacrifices. It was also famed for its Qohoric smiths who could rework Valyrian steel, and for its old story of how Unsullied had once saved the city from a Dothraki horde. That legend had, in part, inspired Daenerys to free the Unsullied from Astapor. Now, ironically, she approached the city as an exile with a fraction of those same warriors. One afternoon, as they neared the approach to Qohor, a foul smell drifted on the breeze. Daenerys wrinkled her nose. Grey Worm halted, raising his hand to stop the column. A mile or so ahead, they saw a scattering of Bodhi. Yes, in a ditch along the roadside. Crows squabbled over the remains, flapping away as the soldiers approached. The corpses seemed half-rotted, and some had nasty boils on their arms and faces. "Plague," Missandei whispered, hand flying to her mouth. "Gods help them." Daenerys' stomach churned. The men in the ditch must have been cast out or died on the road, likely refugees from Qohor. This was the first stark sign that the rumors were true. She glanced at Yora, who exhaled grimly. "If the disease is rampant, walking into the city could be a death sentence," he said. "We have no guaranteed immunity." Daenerys felt torn. Perhaps she could try to help these people, but how? She had no knowledge of healing plague. Even her willingness to face fire could do nothing against a sickness that spread unseen. "We'll approach cautiously," she said. "If it's too dangerous, we'll turn south. But let me see if there's any route or quarter of the city that remains safe." They skirted around the ditch, the crows resettling on the bodies once the column passed. The air was thick with dread. The closer they got, the more signs of devastation appeared. An abandoned farmhouse with a door hanging open, rags strewn in the courtyard. A cart overturned in the mud, presumably carrying the possessions of a fleeing family. At intervals, they found small clusters of graves or smoldering pyres, a desperate attempt to contain the plague. Eventually, they glimpsed Qohor's walls rising in the distance, black stone under a haze of smoke. It might have once been an imposing sight, tall ramparts with distinctive horn-like turrets. Now it seemed half-ruined by neglect, or perhaps by the panic of a city in crisis. A battered gate stood ajar, unguarded. Daenerys halted her forces at a safe distance, scanning the battlements. No watchmen patrolled, or if they did, they were hidden. She dismounted, and the dust swirled around her boots. Grey Worm, Yora, and Missandei joined her, gazing upon Qohor with similar trepidation. "It looks abandoned," Missandei said, her voice hushed. "Or nearly so." Grey Worm glanced around. "We should not enter unless we know what awaits inside." Savid and his men approached, also dismounting. One of them spoke up. "We heard that Qohor's priests tried to sacrifice more animals, and perhaps humans, to the Black Goat, hoping to drive away the plague. But apparently it spread regardless." A shiver coursed down Daenerys' spine. "Even so, some must remain within," she said. "I need answers about the road south, about the rumored warlords." She drew a breath. "We'll take a small scouting party inside, only those willing. The rest remain camped here, well outside the city, with strict orders to keep watch for infection. If I find no help within, we'll depart immediately." Yora frowned but nodded. "I'll come with you, of course." Grey Worm pressed a hand to his bandaged shoulder. "I will join you, Your Grace. My place is at your side." She appreciated his loyalty but worried about exposing him. Still, she knew better than to refuse his sense of duty. Missandei also spoke up. "I should come," she began, but Daenerys held up a hand. "No," Daenerys said gently. "If there is danger of plague, I need you to remain with the men, coordinate supplies, and see that none break discipline. You're too valuable to risk, Missandei." She saw reluctance in her friend's eyes, but Missandei nodded obediently. Before they departed, Daenerys issued orders to keep a quarantine perimeter. Any who ventured into the city with her would remain separated upon return until certain no sickness spread. The men listened with a mix of relief at not having to enter the plague-ridden walls and concern for their queen. With Grey Worm, Yora, Savid, and 2 unsullied volunteers, Daenerys made her way to the gaping city gate. The road was lined with overgrown weeds. Inside, they found deserted streets. Some buildings stood with their doors flung wide, broken furniture littering the thresholds. The stench of decay hovered in the air. Flies buzzed near dark alleyways where lumps of refuse, and possibly corpses, lay. They advanced cautiously, eyes scanning for any sign of life. Now and then, they glimpsed movement, someone peering from a shuttered window or darting across a side street. But no one approached them. Daenerys tried not to let her disgust show. She had seen the aftermath of war, but plague was a different horror. There was no visible wound to treat, no single enemy to defeat. Disease crept silently, undoing entire communities. Eventually, they reached what looked like a small shrine to the Black Goat. A twisted statue reared up in the courtyard, depicting a horned creature with an insatiable maw. Daenerys felt a shiver of revulsion. Bloodstains marred the stone altar at the statue's feet, congealed into a dark crust. Yora muttered a quiet oath. Grey Worm scanned their surroundings, spear at the ready. From the shadows of the shrine emerged a figure draped in dark robes. Pale hands clutched a staff. The cowl hid the face, but a rasping voice addressed them. "You should not be here," the figure said in a heavily accented common tongue. "The plague devours all." Daenerys stepped forward. "I am Daenerys Targaryen. We came seeking refuge. Is there no safe quarter in Qohor?" A wet laugh escaped the figure, a sound halfway between mirth and despair. "No safety," the voice said. "Not unless you can appease the Black Goat. The city bleeds out and the goat drinks deep. The plague is an offering gone awry." The figure lifted the cowl enough to show a face etched with sorrow and pox scars. "I am a priest of the temple. We tried everything, sacrifices of goats, bulls, even men. The goat did not answer. Instead, disease spreads. The people flee or die." A pang of pity lanced Daenerys' heart, but also revulsion at the mention of human sacrifice. She kept her voice neutral. "We do not worship your Black Goat, but we came hoping for trade or knowledge. Is there no one left to govern Qohor?" "The council is gone," the priest replied. "Some died, some abandoned the city. The few who remain cower indoors, waiting for the plague to pass. But it will not pass." Daenerys felt Grey Worm's uneasy shift behind her. Yora's hand hovered near his sword. They feared contagion, and rightly so. But she pressed on, voice calm. "Then we will not linger. We only seek passage and any reliable news of the roads to Volantis. Are they passable, or have warlords taken them?" The priest coughed, a hollow sound. "The roads to the south are rumored to be patrolled by brigands. You might do better to skirt east, cross the forest, and head south beyond the outskirts of the plague's reach. But if you intend to go straight south on the main road, you risk more than disease. There are men there who kill travelers for scraps. Qohor's walls no longer protect them." Daenerys' shoulders sagged. So the rumor of warlords near Qohor's domain was confirmed. Another obstacle in her path. She glanced at Yora, who gave her a resigned look as if to say, "This is how it always goes." "Thank you," she said to the priest, though the courtesy felt hollow. "We will leave you in peace." The priest's lips twitched, as if forming the ghost of a smile. "There is no peace in Qohor now, only death. If you value your lives, be gone." Daenerys turned, and her small party withdrew from the shrine, stepping quickly back into the deserted streets. She forced herself not to retch at the smell of decay. Her head throbbed with tension, and the wound on her shoulder burned beneath the bandages. She wanted to blame someone for the plague, for the horrors that had befallen this place, but the harsh truth was that illness was a force beyond the usual scope of war. She thought of her own titles, unburnt, breaker of chains, mother of dragons, but she had no title for banishing plague. They found their way back to the gate, passing a few vacant-eyed survivors who hid behind doorways or rummaged for scraps. No one begged them for aid. Perhaps the plague had ravaged all hope from them. The sight gnawed at Daenerys's conscience. Once, she might have tried to free them from tyranny, but what freedom could she offer from sickness and despair? At last, they exited the city, relieved to gulp fresh air, though the tinge of corruption clung to their senses. Grey Worm immediately called for a quarantine perimeter. The small party that had entered Qohor removed their cloaks and outer garments, burnt them in a quick pyre, and washed their hands and faces with the water they had. A meager precaution, but the best they could manage. Missandei watched anxiously, ensuring all of Daenerys' instructions were followed. When it was done, Daenerys returned to her larger camp, shaking her damp hair free. She saw the unsaid question in the eyes of her followers. Could we have settled here if not for the plague? The answer was clear. No, the city was as good as dead or dying. She summoned Yora, Grey Worm, Missandei, and Savid to a clearing near the tents. They formed a tight circle. Daenerys relayed what the priest had said about the roads, her voice steady but subdued. It seems if we attempt the main south road, we risk bandits and warlords. If we try to skirt east, we plunge into unknown wilderness. The priest claimed it might be safer, but either route is perilous. Missandei folded her arms, anxiety plain on her face. The forest to the east of Qohor is said to be vast and dark. Some tales say it's haunted by old gods or shadow creatures, but we do not know if that's just superstition. Yora pursed his lips. Even if it is superstition, the forest is rarely traveled, which might mean fewer bandits. Most warlords stick to roads where they can raid caravans. Grey Worm nodded in agreement. We are disciplined and can march in formation through the forest, though it may slow us. It might be safer than confronting an organized group of raiders on the main road. Savid hesitated, then cleared his throat. I've traveled near the outskirts of that forest once. It's true there are fewer travelers, meaning fewer potential threats, but it's easy to get lost, and we'd need to ensure a steady water supply. Daenerys considered their words, weighing each option. The memory of plague-ridden Qohor hung over her like a shadow, fueling her desire to leave this region behind as swiftly as possible. We'll take the forest route, she decided. We have enough provisions to last a while, and we can hunt if needed. Better to risk the unknown wilds than certain conflict with warlords. Let them keep their roads. Her advisors nodded, relieved to have a plan, albeit a precarious one. Missandei set to organizing the supplies, making sure they had containers for water. Grey Worm relayed new marching orders to the Unsullied. Yora stood with Daenerys, glancing at the dark outline of trees looming in the distance. We've crossed deserts and seas, he said quietly, but an ancient forest might be a new challenge. He paused, then added, Still, I'll take trees over that stench of death in Qohor. Daenerys nodded. Any place is better than Qohor now. Gods be merciful to those trapped there. They broke camp the following morning, turning away from the main road and forging an easterly path toward the Treeline. The horse-drawn wagons rattled over uneven ground as the sun climbed. Daenerys rode near the front, with Yora and Grey Worm flanking her, while Missandei and Savid helped coordinate the supply wagons. The further they went, the thicker and darker the vegetation became, as if the forest itself resisted their presence. Enormous pines and oaks with twisted trunks loomed over the path, branches woven together to filter out most sunlight. Moss dripped from the limbs in long strands, and the undergrowth was alive with the rustle of unseen creatures. At times, Daenerys thought she saw flickers of movement between the trees, but whenever she looked closely, nothing was there. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a sharp contrast to the dryness of the Dothraki Sea. The path narrowed, forcing them to proceed in single file where once there might have been an old trail. Ruts in the ground hinted that someone had passed here months or years prior, but no fresh tracks marred the moss. The darkness pressed in around them, and the horses grew skittish, ears flicking at every strange sound. The Unsullied marched with their usual stoicism, though Daenerys could sense their unease. They made slow progress over the next several days, felling the occasional sapling to clear the way for the wagons. The forest was eerily quiet most of the time, punctuated by sudden rustling or the distant call of a bird that none of them recognized. At night, they set up camp in small clearings, piling wood for fires to keep at bay whatever lurked in the gloom. More than once, Daenerys saw fleeting shapes at the edge of the firelight, a flash of pale fur or glowing eyes. Wolves, perhaps, or something else. Each passing day heightened the tension. Daenerys felt as though the very trees were watching her, resentful of the intrusion. Missandei mentioned old tales from Noth about haunted forests, and though Daenerys dismissed them as legends, her nerves frayed with each snapping twig. She found herself thinking of Drogon, of how his black wings would blot out the canopy if he hunted here. Part of her yearned to see him again, if only to have him drive away the oppressive sense of dread that clung to the forest. On the 5th day within the woods, it rained again, a cold and relentless downpour. The ground turned muddy, and progress slowed to a miserable crawl. One of the wagons lost a wheel in a hidden rut, forcing the men to stop and repair it in the torrent. Daenerys stood beneath a crude awning of branches, holding her cloak tight, lips pressed in frustration. The canopy above offered little protection from the sheets of rain that filtered down. The horses snorted and stomped, thoroughly spooked. Grey Worm came to her side, water streaming down his face. "Your Grace," he said. "The men are tired, but they remain disciplined. We should find higher ground for camp soon, or we risk being stuck in the mud." She nodded, blinking away raindrops. "Yes, do it." Her voice sounded muffled under the steady roar of rainfall. "Once the wagon is repaired, we'll push on until we find better footing." At that moment, a shriek pierced the air. A horse's scream, cut short. Daenerys whirled, heart leaping into her throat. Through the curtains of rain, she saw a shape bounding away among the trees. The men shouted, brandishing spears. One of the wagon drivers lay sprawled in the mud, a jagged wound across his chest. Blood mingled with rainwater, forming ribbons of red in the gray muck. A second horse reared, eyes rolling white, then bolted. Grey Worm rushed toward the scene, spear up. Yora came sprinting from the other side, sword unsheathed. Missandei stood by the wagon, face pale. Daenerys struggled to see through the downpour. "What was it?" she yelled over the din. "Some beast," shouted one of the Unsullied, kneeling by the fallen driver. "It came from the undergrowth, attacked, and vanished." Daenerys' stomach clenched. "Is he dead?" The Unsullied confirmed grimly, pressing a hand over the man's staring eyes. Several soldiers rushed into the trees, trying to track the creature, but the heavy rain had already obliterated footprints. All they found were broken branches and streaks of mud. Whatever it was, wolf, bear, or something more unnatural, it moved with terrifying swiftness and cunning. They regrouped near the wagon. Daenerys knelt beside the fallen driver, feeling guilt churn within her. He had chosen to follow her into exile. Now he was dead by a lurking predator. She bowed her head, letting the rain plaster her hair to her cheeks. Grey Worm silently waited, spear in hand. Yora knelt, checking the man's wounds. A single, powerful slash to the chest, as if from massive claws or fangs. Missandei shivered, pushing soaked curls from her eyes. "We must find safer ground," she managed, voice trembling with shock. Daenerys rose, forcing composure. "We move. Now, keep torches lit, even in the rain if we can manage it. Double the guard on all flanks. Whatever that thing was, we cannot let it pick us off again." The men sprang into action, forging ahead with grim determination. They left the driver's body behind, covering it with a cloth, for burying or burning in this rain was impossible. The entire column felt shaken. The forest pressed closer, thick trunks looming like silent sentinels. Daenerys rode with her hand near the hilt of a dagger, eyes scanning the shadows. The horses whickered nervously, ears pinned back. An hour later, they found a slight rise in the ground, a cluster of old, mossy boulders that provided partial shelter. Grey Worm deployed the Unsullied in a defensive circle, spears outward, while the rest of the group huddled in the center. They lit more torches, their flames sputtering in the wet, but still providing some measure of light and safety. Daenerys stood in the center, drenched to the bone, giving orders to Missandei about where to pitch the tents. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from behind the boulders. Several soldiers spun, brandishing spears. A shape scuttled away, silent as a wraith. This time, at least, no one fell. But Daenerys felt her heart hammer. Clearly, some predator or predators stalked them. The men whispered of giant wolves or twisted forest cats. Savid muttered something about unnatural guardians said to roam Qohor's woods. Daenerys did her best to quell the superstitious fear, but even she felt uneasy. They managed to raise 2 tents, sagging under the weight of the rain. Daenerys took a seat inside one, along with Missandei and Jorah, while Grey Worm and the Unsullied maintained a perimeter. The constant drumming of water on canvas threatened to drive them mad. Mud sucked at every bootstep. Still, they felt safer than standing in the open. "It seems we have no shortage of dangers," Daenerys said bitterly, glancing at Jorah. "Plague behind us, warlords on the roads, beasts in the forest. Do the gods toy with me for their amusement?" Jorah removed his soaked gloves, setting them aside. "Sometimes it feels that way," he admitted, exhaustion lining his face. "We'll endure as we always have." Missandei paced the cramped tent. "We must believe this forest will end. If we can just push through the far side, we can turn south, find an open route. Perhaps from there, Volantis is within reach." Daenerys gazed at the tent flaps, half expecting another shriek. "Volantis," she said softly, "a city that once championed the Valyrian freehold, that still clings to relics of the old ways. Will they greet me as a savior or a threat? I have no illusions that I'll be welcomed with open arms, especially not if news of Drogon's rampage preceded me." Jorah nodded. "Volantis has many factions. Some see you as a breaker of chains, others as a menace to trade. But the Red Temple may show you favor. They once had a priestess who spoke of you as Azor Ahai Reborn, or some such figure. Perhaps they'll aid you if you promise them your support." Daenerys's eyes flickered. She recalled meeting Thuras of Myr in passing, hearing tales of Melisandre, the Shadowbinder who served Stannis Baratheon, and other priests of the Red God. "And if they do not?" she asked. "What if they brand me a false prophet? I cannot rely on their superstition." "We'll find another way," Jorah assured her, though his tone was weary. "But let us not despair too soon. One step at a time. Survive the forest, avoid the warlords, and we'll see what awaits us in Volantis." Daenerys nodded, forcing herself to cling to that plan. The alternative was to surrender to hopelessness. She was Daenerys Stormborn, the Unburnt. She could not let a cursed forest or a band of brigands break her any more than she would let slavers or the Sons of the Harpy do so. That night was a tense vigil. Rain battered the tents, and every so often, the guards glimpsed movement at the edge of the torchlight, low shapes prowling among the trees. But no further attacks came. By morning, the rain had tapered to a misty drizzle, and they resumed the arduous march, forging deeper into the forest with torches lit even in daylight. The men were on constant alert, scanning the gloom with straining eyes. At one point, Daenerys thought she caught sight of a pale, emaciated creature perched on a branch overhead, eyes reflecting the torchlight. It vanished in a blur, leaving only a faint hiss. She told no one, unsure if her mind had played tricks in the half-light. She only quickened her pace, urging the group to keep moving. They pressed on for another 3 days, picking their way over rough, root-choked ground and around fallen logs slick with moss. Their rations ran low, forcing them to hunt for game. The forest offered some small deer, but the men dreaded going off alone. They set traps near the camp, snaring what they could. Water was plentiful from the many streams that meandered through the woods, though the men boiled it carefully, wary of contamination. On the morning of the 3rd day, the trees began to thin. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy. Daenerys felt a surge of relief. The forest seemed to relent at last, opening into a gently sloping plain. Though scattered stands of trees still dotted the horizon, They were spaced widely enough to allow a sense of open sky. She took a deep breath, tasting freedom after days of claustrophobic gloom. The men murmured in gratitude. Yora wiped his brow, scanning the distance. "Looks like we'll soon be out of the deep woods," he said. "Then we can angle south, skirt the plague zone, and pick up a route to Volantis." Daenerys nodded, heart lighter. She urged her horse forward, the beast snorting in relief at the open terrain. The ground, though damp, was more manageable than the tangle of roots behind them. Savid and his men rode ahead, scouting for threats. Grey Worm led a vanguard of Unsullied. Missandei kept near the supply wagons, ensuring no stragglers were left behind. By midday, they reached a rolling grassland that reminded Daenerys of the outskirts of the Dothraki Sea, though this one was not quite so vast. It seemed the forest receded behind them in a dark line, as if watching them depart with silent resentment. Daenerys spared a final glance over her shoulder, shuddering at the memory of that predator's shriek. She hoped never to return to those woods. In the distance, small hills rose and fell, with scattered trees along the ridges. Savid guided them east-southeast, explaining that the main roads lay far to the west, where the plague might still loom. They would find smaller trails used by local tribes or travelers from the southern trade routes, which should allow them to bypass any major conflict. It was risky, but better than stumbling into the arms of warlords. They paused near a shallow stream for a brief rest. Daenerys dismounted, smoothing her mare's flank. The sun felt warm on her face, and she allowed herself a moment of gratitude. They had survived Qohor's outskirts, the plague, and the haunted forest. Her men were tired, but they lived. For a heartbeat, she felt a glimmer of optimism. Her reverie shattered when she heard hoofbeats, several horses approaching at a gallop from the south. Grey Worm snapped to attention, motioning for the Unsullied to form a loose defensive perimeter. Daenerys swung back into her saddle, scanning the horizon. Savid raised a hand, shading his eyes, and muttered, "Riders, maybe 15 or 20. They're moving fast." Her heart quickened. Another Khalasar? Bandits? The rumored warlords? She braced herself, recalling how they had just escaped the forest and had no easy retreat. The riders crested a low hill and descended toward the stream. Spears glinted in the sun. Daenerys counted roughly 18. Their attire looked varied. Some wore mismatched armor, others simple leather jerkins. A ragtag group, perhaps, but armed and numerous. They slowed as they neared, spreading out in an arc. One man rode forward, beard braided with small bronze rings. He lifted a hand in greeting, though his eyes were cautious. "Hail!" he called. "You're far off the beaten paths. Who leads you?" Daenerys urged her horse a step ahead. "I am Daenerys Targaryen," she said clearly. "We mean no harm. We're traveling south." At her name, a stir went through the riders. Some frowned, others exchanged pointed looks. The leader's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "Daenerys Targaryen? The mother of dragons? I thought you had fled far west, or else rotted in Meereen. Strange to find you here." Grey Worm's grip tightened on his spear. Daenerys forced calm. "We have no quarrel with travelers or anyone else," she said. "We only seek passage." "Who are you?" The man chuckled without warmth. "Who am I? A man who's lost everything because of dragons and the wars they fueled. My name is Orlek. I once served a merchant prince who traded in Yunkai, Astapor, and Meereen. All fell to your rampage and the chaos that followed. Now I survive on scraps." He nodded at the men behind him. "These are my fellows. We've learned to make our living in the borderlands, collecting tolls from passers-by." "Tolls?" Yora repeated, voice edged with distrust. "You mean robbery?" Orlek shrugged. "Call it what you will, but if you want to pass, you pay. Or you fight. And I see you have some skilled warriors with you." His gaze flicked over the Unsullied. "But do you have the numbers to best us?" "We have archers, too." Daenerys suppressed a sigh. Another challenge. Another test of might. She couldn't afford to lose men in a skirmish. "Name your price," she said coolly. Orlek's smile widened. How generous of you. Let's say 3 gold coins for each soldier you command. And for you, perhaps some personal items. I see that ring on your finger, and we might ask your sworn men for their armor. Sell it in the next city, if there's one still standing. Grey Worm's eyes narrowed. Daenerys felt indignation flare. She was no stranger to paying tribute for safe passage when absolutely necessary, but Orlek's demands were meant to humiliate. She recalled that the group behind Orlek had recognized her name, Daenerys Targaryen, who once toppled slavers. They might relish forcing her to yield. Her eyes swept across the enemy ranks. 18 riders, some with bows, some with spears or swords. The Unsullied numbered more than that, though not by a large margin. Yet her men were disciplined, and these brigands looked like a ragged bunch. If a fight broke out, it would be bloody, but victory was not impossible. The question was whether she wanted more bloodshed. Yora leaned in, whispering, "We could fight, but it'll cost lives. They have archers. We do, too, but they have the high ground from that slope." Daenerys heard the faint sound of shifting behind her. The men were preparing to defend her. She glanced at Grey Worm, whose jaw set in a silent vow to protect her at all costs. Paying a toll would degrade their meager supplies, leaving them more vulnerable down the road. Yet unleashing battle here risked further losses and might even draw more trouble. She opened her mouth to speak but was interrupted by a sudden roar, a sound that cut through the still air and reverberated in Daenerys's bones. That roar was unmistakable, a savage thunder that once inspired awe in her heart. Drogon. Instantly, everyone's attention whipped to the sky. A dark shape swept across the clouds, massive wings casting a broad shadow on the hillside. The horses of Orlek's men neighed in panic. The Unsullied tightened ranks, shifting to protect Daenerys. Her own heart hammered with shock and a strange wave of longing. Drogon was here. Was it chance, or some uncanny sense that drew him to her presence? He circled once, far overhead, as if assessing the scene. Daenerys's breath caught in her throat. Her last encounters with him had been catastrophic. Was he here to attack, or had some flicker of memory guided him to her side? She couldn't be certain. Orlek and his men were clearly terrified. Several tried to spur their horses to flee, but Orlek shouted, "Hold, you cowards! Draw your bows!" They fumbled for arrows, eyes darting skyward. Daenerys found her voice. "No!" she shouted at Orlek. "Don't provoke him." She recalled how easily Drogon had torched entire companies of soldiers. If these brigands shot at him, it would end in an inferno. The memory of her own men burned alive haunted her. It was too late. A few of Orlek's archers loosed arrows at the sky, though the distance was too great for any real effect. Drogon roared again, evidently enraged by the feeble attack. He angled his wings and plunged in a deadly dive, black scales shining. Fire flickered in his maw. "Scatter!" Daenerys screamed, jerking her horse aside. Her men scrambled. Orlek's group panicked, half of them wheeling their mounts around to flee. Drogon unleashed a torrent of flame that washed over the hillside, immolating 2 men who were too slow. Screams split the air. Horses bolted, some trailing flames. Grey Worm bellowed commands to the Unsullied, who tried to form a defensive circle around Daenerys, but she could barely see through the chaos. The stench of burning flesh and hair scorched her senses. Drogon swooped overhead, scorching the ground again, setting the tall grass ablaze. "Drogon!" Daenerys cried out in High Valyrian, voice breaking. "Please, no!" She wanted to quell his fury, but her words sounded desperate even to her own ears. She couldn't be sure he even heard them. The swirl of smoke and flame filled the air, choking out all else. In the thick of it, Orlek's men scattered, some riding for their lives, others madly loosing arrows at the dragon. Daenerys saw a stray arrow graze Drogon's flank, prompting a roar of agony. He whipped around and set another patch of ground aflame, sending men tumbling. Amid the havoc, a wave of heat knocked Daenerys's horse sideways. She barely kept her seat, shielding her face from the inferno. Tears blinded her, and the horse reared, nearly throwing her. Through the haze, she glimpsed Drogon banking low. His colossal form was close enough that she felt the wind from his wings. Their eyes met for an instant. His molten gold gaze locked on hers, full of wrath and something she couldn't name. "Drogon," she rasped again, arm outstretched, a feeble gesture. Time seemed to slow. She recalled the days when he perched on her shoulder as a hatchling, nuzzling her cheek, the nights in Meereen when she sang him to calm his restlessness. Now, his eyes burned with savage distance, as if she were just another figure in his domain. Then he roared and wheeled away, climbing into the sky. His wings beat a thunderous rhythm. Flames licked at the grass below, feeding on the carnage he had wrought. A few of Orlek's men, still ablaze, writhed in the mud. Those who survived sprinted west, no longer caring about tolls or coin, simply desperate to escape the unstoppable wrath of a dragon. The Unsullied hastened to douse small fires near the supply wagons. Grey Worm found Daenerys, guiding her spooked horse back toward the group. Yora joined them, coughing through the smoke. "Are you all right?" he asked hoarsely, scanning her for injuries. She swallowed, tears of shock on her cheeks. She felt singed hair around her face, the heat blistering her skin, though she wasn't consumed by flame. "I'm alive," she managed. Above, Drogon soared higher, letting out a final roar before vanishing into the distance. Daenerys watched him go, heartbreak knifing through her. Yet again, he had recognized her presence. She felt certain of it, and yet he had unleashed his fire anyway, slaughtering men around her. He might have spared her specifically, for the flames had not touched her position, but that small mercy was overshadowed by the devastation. Smoke curled across the scorched hillside. Orlek and his men were gone, either dead or fled. A portion of the grass still smoldered, sending up acrid fumes. The Unsullied hurried to stamp out stray flames so they wouldn't spread. The horses trembled, eyes rolling white. Missandei approached, face ashen. Daenerys slid from her saddle, nearly collapsing as her knees wobbled. Grey Worm supported her, careful not to aggravate her old wound. She breathed heavily, head spinning. "It appears the Dragonbane alliance is not the only threat," Yora murmured grimly, surveying the carnage. "Drogon's rage remains boundless." Daenerys stared at the sky where Drogon had disappeared. Her chest tightened with grief and fury. "He recognized me," she whispered, "but it meant nothing." She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. "He's lost to his anger, his wild nature, or he hates me. I don't know." Grey Worm's voice was gentle, almost paternal. "We must move quickly. The smoke will draw attention, and we don't want to be here if others come." Daenerys swallowed the knot of despair, forcing herself to command. Yes, gather the living. Let's be away from here." They fled the scorched scene, leaving the dead behind. The hillside smoldered in Drogon's wake, a testament to his lethal might. Daenerys rode as though in a fog, hardly registering the shouts of men or the frightened neighs of horses. Missandei tried to comfort her, but Daenerys felt numb. Eventually, they made camp farther along the rolling plains, well away from the burn site. The men were silent, unsettled by how close they had come to perishing under dragonfire. Yora approached Daenerys that evening, finding her perched on a small rock, staring at the setting sun that stained the clouds red. He sat beside her carefully, mindful of her need for space. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "That was the closest we've come to Drogon in many weeks. You believe he saw you?" She nodded slowly, recalling the fleeting moment of locked gazes. "Yes, I felt it, but he didn't return to me. He brought only death." She clenched her jaw, pushing away tears. "I do not blame him for defending himself against the arrows, but the ferocity, the disregard for everything." She shuddered, trailing off. Yora placed a hand on her arm. "Dragons are not dogs to heel at our word. Perhaps in time he will remember your bond. But for now, we must remain vigilant." Daenerys let out a shaky breath. "Is that all I can do? Wait for him to decide not to kill me?" The question sounded bitter, but she couldn't help it. She was exhausted, haunted by the faces of those who had died under Drogon's flames. "You are still Daenerys Targaryen," Yora said gently. "The world has not seen the last of you. Whether Drogon returns or not, you must keep going. If the Red Temple in Volantis has knowledge that might help you restore or sever the bond, we should learn it. Maybe there is a way to calm him, or at least save others from his wrath." She nodded, though she felt a hollow ache in her chest. "We'll see," she said softly. "I will not abandon him, nor can I let him slaughter at will. But how to stop a dragon that won't heed my voice?" Yora had no easy answer. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from the place where Drogon had unleashed his fury. The two of them sat in silence, the last of the day's light fading into dusk. Daenerys lifted her gaze to the star-strewn sky, remembering how she had once soared across it on Drogon's back, an indomitable queen. Now that memory felt like a distant dream. But she was alive. She was still unburnt. And if she had learned anything in her trials, it was that life persisted even in the face of impossible odds. She would continue, blood of the dragon, even if her greatest ally had become her greatest torment. The days that followed were punctuated by a tense vigilance. The possibility of Drogon lurking anywhere overhead weighed on everyone's minds. Daenerys pressed onward, forging a route that would eventually curve south to Volantis. At times, they encountered small hamlets or lone travelers, most of whom hastily gave them wide berth. The sight of unsullied spears and Targaryen banners, still carried by a handful of devoted men, stirred fear more often than recognition. Word of Drogon's rampages had spread far, and the name Daenerys Targaryen was tied to that terror whether she willed it or not. She tried not to let it crush her spirit. Occasionally, Savid and his men scouted ahead, searching for safe passage and any sign of the rumored Dragonbane alliance. They returned with scattered intelligence. News of a slaver prince raising forces in the old lands near Astapor, a band of freedmen forming a militia to protect themselves from raiders, the uneasy alliances in the west shifting like sand. But no direct confrontation seemed imminent. Drogon moved like a storm cloud, unpredictable, devastating wherever he alighted. At last, they crested a ridgeline to see the beginnings of a broad river valley, a territory that would, if their charts held correct, guide them toward Volantis. The land looked greener, dotted with farms that had not yet been deserted. Smoke from hearth fires curled above distant cottages. Daenerys felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this region had been spared the worst. She ordered a cautious approach, sending a scout forward under a banner of peace. After a few hours, he returned with word that the local lords recognized Volantis's overarching authority but largely governed themselves. They had heard of plague in Qohor, so they were wary, but they might allow passage if properly greeted. Daenerys considered it, concluding she could not barge into these lands like a conqueror. She would proceed diplomatically, hoping to avoid further skirmishes. Late that afternoon, they came upon a quaint village perched beside a slow, meandering river. Fields of tall grass rippled in the breeze. The villagers, mostly farmers and shepherds, watched with wide eyes as the column of unsullied and travelers approached. Daenerys rode at the front, cloak billowing behind her, trying to appear neither threatening nor weak. Yora and Missandei flanked her, with Grey Worm close at hand. A handful of village men armed with crude spears and pitchforks emerged, forming a makeshift line. Daenerys halted at a respectful distance. One of the villagers, an older man with gray stubble, stepped forward. "We've got no gold or surplus for your armies," he said bluntly. "We can't feed you. We barely feed ourselves." Daenerys raised a hand. "I am not here to take your food or gold," she said in the common tongue. "We ask only for safe passage and perhaps a place to water our horses. We have our own supplies." The old man eyed her suspiciously. "And who might you be?" She hesitated. Revealing her name sometimes did more harm than good, but deception felt wrong. "I am Daenerys Targaryen," she said calmly, bracing for their reaction. "We journey to Volantis. We mean you no harm." A murmur swept through the villagers. Some paled, others looked confused. One woman clutched a small child to her chest. The old man seemed at a loss. Targaryen? We've heard that name from travelers. Something about a dragon. His eyes darted skyward nervously. We want no trouble with dragons, or anything else. Daenerys suppressed a weary sigh. Nor do I, she lied. I can pay you for any spare fodder for our horses, or for fresh water. We'll leave as soon as we've rested. The old man glanced at the line of Unsullied, at the disciplined stances of men who could likely overwhelm the village in minutes. You swear you won't harm us? Daenerys inclined her head. You have my word. No harm. He studied her face, then nodded slowly. Very well. Come to the river. Water your horses. If you have coin, we have a few sacks of oats we can spare, no more. Our harvest was poor. She offered a faint smile. Thank you. Grey Worm directed a portion of the Unsullied to remain outside the village, ensuring they didn't appear too imposing. Daenerys, Yora, Missandei, and a handful of soldiers guided the horses to the riverbank. The water was clear and cool, and the animals drank thirstily. A handful of curious children peeked from behind tree stumps, giggling nervously. One boy ventured close enough to stare at Missandei's curly hair, as if he'd never seen its like. Missandei offered him a friendly smile, and he scurried away, half laughing. Daenerys watched the scene, exhaustion mingling with a faint warmth in her chest. She recalled simpler times in Lazer, when she had tried to protect the Lambfolk from Dothraki raiders. She turned to the old villager who seemed in charge. Is there trouble here? She asked gently. Raiders? Bandits? We've encountered many such threats in these parts. The man spat into the grass. Some talk of that, but we're small folk. Raiders rarely find us worth the effort. We've heard worse rumors about a dragon burning fields. But that's far from here, we pray. We only worry about our next harvest. Daenerys nodded, pained by the mention of dragonfire. May the gods be kind to you, she said softly. We won't linger. She paid the man with a small pouch of silver coins, which Missandei handed over. The villagers seemed stunned by such wealth, even if it was meager by a queen's standard. They hastily fetched a few sacks of oats. True to her word, Daenerys led her group away soon after the horses were watered and fed. The villagers watched them go, relief mingled with residual fear. That evening, they set camp a safe distance from the village, near the winding river. The men worked in efficient silence, and Daenerys found herself on a small knoll with Yora, gazing at the water's reflection of the sunset. Pinks and oranges shimmered across the ripples. She felt an emptiness in her soul, a longing for something she could no longer name. She broke the silence with a soft voice. Seeing those villagers, I realized how simple life can be for some, even in hardship. They have small joys, small hopes. I once thought I would bring them the greatest joy, freedom from tyrants. But now, all they see is fear when they hear my name. Yora watched the sunset with her. They fear dragons, not you, he said. But they don't separate the two. That's the burden of House Targaryen. She closed her eyes, letting the evening breeze caress her cheeks. Burden indeed, she whispered. I sometimes wish the dragons had never come to me, if they were only to bring such ruin. And yet, no, I can't say that. They were my children. They were my birthright. But oh, how my heart aches for what I've lost. He laid a hand gently on her shoulder, careful of the old wound. I know, and I wish I had the power to restore what's lost. But we must keep going. There's always a path forward. You taught me that long ago. Daenerys exhaled, leaning into his touch for a brief moment of comfort. Yes, she murmured. Forward. Always forward. In the days that followed, they journeyed deeper south, weaving between farmland and sparse woodlands. The region seemed more stable than Qohor's domain, though occasional rumors of roaming bandits kept them cautious. Daenerys maintained the practice of sending scouts ahead and traveling with a tight formation. Occasionally, they glimpsed small estates belonging to local lords sworn to Volantis, but none challenged them openly. The men were too numerous and well-armed for casual harassment, and apparently no one recognized a reason to blockade them. At last, the spires of Volantis came into view, hazy on the horizon. Great elephants sometimes roamed the city's outskirts, or so the rumors said, but Daenerys saw none as they approached. Instead, she saw the imposing black walls, the fortified gates, and beyond them the famed long bridge spanning the river, lined with markets and dwellings. Torchlights glimmered in the dusk, reflecting off the water. Volantis was ancient, once part of Valyria's empire, and it showed in the architecture. Volcanic stone, towering pillars, monstrous statues. Daenerys halted her company at a distance, considering her next move. Volantis was known for strict social hierarchies and intense devotion to the Red God among certain factions. She recalled that once, a priestess had proclaimed she was the breaker of chains chosen to save the world. Had that fervor endured? Or would she be met with suspicion, especially in light of Drogon's destructive renown? She turned to Yora, Missandei, Grey Worm, and Savid, who formed her informal council now. "We've arrived," she said quietly. "But how do we proceed? Walk openly through the gates, declaring my name, or try something more discreet?" Missandei pursed her lips. "Volantis can be dangerous if we announce you as the Mother of Dragons. The city teems with spies for all manner of interests. Slavers, priests, triarchs who might resent your interference. But if we skulk in like criminals, we risk drawing suspicion anyway." Grey Worm held his spear, silent, letting others speak first. Yora rubbed his jaw. "Perhaps a middle ground. We approach as travelers seeking an audience at the Red Temple. If word spreads that Daenerys Targaryen is here, so be it. But we do not need to parade through the streets announcing it. Let the Red Priests decide if they wish to champion your cause." Daenerys nodded thoughtfully. "I'll not hide my identity, but I won't flaunt it, either. Our men can camp outside the city walls, rotating shifts if the authorities allow it. A smaller escort can accompany me inside to visit the temple. Missandei, you'll come with me. Yura too. Grey Worm, you remain with the majority of the Unsullied outside. If the city guard or the Triarchs become hostile, you'll be ready to intervene." Grey Worm frowned slightly but accepted the plan. "As you say, Your Grace." She looked at Savid. "You and your men may remain with Grey Worm if you wish, or you can venture inside. But mind yourself. Volantis can be tricky, especially for sellswords." Savid bowed. "We'll watch for trouble outside, if that pleases you, Your Grace. My men are not so keen on big cities' intrigues. If you have need of us, we'll stand ready." That settled, they made a cautious approach to the gates. The guards peered at them warily, especially at the disciplined, unsullied ranks and the small cluster of baggage wagons. Daenerys and her inner circle dismounted, stepping forward to speak with the gate captain. He was a stout Volantene man wearing a polished breastplate, the sigil of the 3 Triarchs etched into the metal. "What business have you in Volantis?" he demanded. "We have enough refugees from the north. Plague war. None of it welcome here." Daenerys drew herself up. "I am Daenerys Targaryen," she said, her tone calm and respectful. "I seek an audience with the Red Temple. My men require no more than a place to camp outside the walls, if you'll permit it." She expected shock or hostility, but the captain only frowned, glancing at her silver hair. "Targaryen," he mused. "Some say you freed slaves. Others say you unleashed a dragon that burned cities. I take no sides, but you bring no plague." "No plague," she confirmed. "We steered clear of Qohor and any infected areas. My men are healthy." He grunted. "Very well. A small escort may enter. The rest camp in the fields beyond the eastern gate. The Triarchs might demand tribute, or they might ignore you entirely. Care not. Behave yourselves." He waved a hand to the guards. "Let them pass. Keep an eye on the rest." Daenerys inclined her head in thanks. With that, she led Yora and Missandei inside, along with a half-dozen Unsullied as a personal guard. Grey Worm began organizing the main force outside the walls, setting up a secure perimeter. Volantis assaulted the senses with noise and movement. Even at dusk, The streets teemed with people. Merchants, slaves wearing tattooed faces, nobles carried in palanquins, red-robed priests preaching on corners about the coming of the Lord of Light. The air was heavy with incense and the odor of crowded humanity. Elephants lumbered down wide avenues, carrying goods. Everywhere Daenerys looked, she saw the tension between wealth and poverty, freedom and bondage. She guided her small group toward the grand avenue that led to the Red Temple, recalling glimpses of it from her previous travels. The temple soared above the surrounding buildings, a monument of red-hued stone with pillars shaped like flames. Torches blazed at the entrance, and a throng of worshippers milled about. Some prayed, others cried out for deliverance from war and disease. Several red-robed priests chanted a hymn to R'hllor, the light of the world. Daenerys dismounted, handing her reins to one of the Unsullied. Missandei and Jorah did likewise. Together, they approached the temple steps, the heat of dozens of braziers washing over them. A priestess with shaved head and painted eyebrows spotted Daenerys, eyes widening. She spoke in High Valyrian. "You come here under the sign of the comet, or so some foretold. Are you truly the breaker of chains?" Daenerys blinked, surprised by the immediate recognition. "I am Daenerys Stormborn," she said in Valyrian. "I come seeking counsel. My dragon is lost to me. I hope the temple might offer guidance." The priestess bowed low, as if greeting a revered figure. "You were foretold, you know. We have heard the prophecy. Some call you Azor Ahai Reborn, the princess that was promised, the flame that would cleanse the darkness. But your flame has grown wild." Daenerys's heart hammered. She glanced at Jorah, who looked as startled as she felt. She swallowed. "Yes, Drogon rages across Essos. I seek a way to stop the destruction, or bring him back to me if possible." The priestess beckoned them inside. The interior of the temple was cavernous, lit by towering braziers. Statues depicting R'hllor's flaming heart lined the walls, and the air was thick with perfumed smoke. Chanting echoed from unseen corridors. Gathered at the center was a small group of priests and priestesses, all wearing red robes of various shades, some with flaming symbols embroidered on their sleeves. As Daenerys approached, they turned in unison, eyes reflecting the firelight with an eerie intensity. One of them, an older priest with a long gray beard and fierce eyes, stepped forward. He spoke in the common tongue, voice resonant as though used to preaching. "Daenerys Targaryen, we have awaited your coming. The Lord of Light has shown us visions. We saw a woman wreathed in flame, astride a black dragon, and the world quaking at her feet. We believed you would be the salvation. Now we see your dragon's shadow, and it brings only ruin." Daenerys felt the sting of guilt. "I did not choose for Drogon to turn on me," she said, trying to keep her tone steady. "But I must right this wrong. If there is any knowledge, any power you can share, help me. I will do whatever it takes." The older priest studied her, as though reading her soul in the flicker of the torches. "R'hllor is the fire of life and creation, but also destruction. Dragons are living flame, bound to those who share their fire. If your bond is broken, perhaps it can be mended. But it will not be easy." She dared to hope. "Tell me how," she whispered. A priestess with coppery hair stepped forward, taking the older priest's place. Her voice was lilting, almost hypnotic. "You must face the darkness in your own heart, Daenerys Targaryen. The prophecy says Azor Ahai tempered a blade in the blood of the one he loved most. You gave life to your dragons through blood and fire. If Drogon is lost, perhaps it requires another sacrifice to bind him once again." A chill coursed through Daenerys, recalling the night she burned Mirri Maz Duur. That woman's death had been the price for hatching her eggs. Sacrifice? I have already sacrificed so much. My child, my husband, my innocence. The copper-haired priestess's eyes gleamed. "The fires demand what they demand. You ask for our guidance. We can show you certain rites, certain prayers that might allow you to summon Drogon and attempt to rekindle the bond. But the cost, you alone must bear." Jorah tensed beside her, voice thick with concern. "What is this cost?" The priestess glanced at him, then back to Daenerys. "A life freely given, or perhaps more than one. The Lord of Light's ways are mysterious. But the forging of Azor Ahai's blade required the soul of his beloved. Blood for blood, fire for fire. That is the old law of magic." Daenerys's vision swam. She recalled how Drogo's life had withered due to black sorcery, how the price for hatching her dragons had been entangled with the death of an innocent foal, as well as Miri's life. It seemed every stride of her destiny was stained with blood. She swallowed, tears threatening. "I can't," she began, her voice breaking. "I won't kill one of my own to reclaim Drogon." The priestess watched her calmly. "You must decide what you are willing to give. But be warned. If Drogon continues unchecked, the devastation will only grow. Others will pay in blood." The older priest placed a hand on the priestess's shoulder, turning to Daenerys. "We can offer other means, less certain, less dire. Invocations to call a dragon from afar, potions to sharpen your connection. But all pale in comparison to the power of sacrifice." Daenerys felt Yora's hand on her elbow, steadying her. Missandei stood behind her, eyes brimming with alarm. She realized she was trembling. She had come seeking a solution, but the Red Temple offered only the old cruelty of blood magic. Memories of Miri Maz Dur's screams, of the unborn Rego, churned her stomach. "Is there no other way?" she pleaded, voice raw. "No way to speak to him, calm him without taking an innocent life?" The priest gave a sympathetic but firm shake of his head. "We do not claim to speak for all magic, but ancient powers demand their price. That is the nature of forging bonds with living fire. You asked for truth, and we have given it." Daenerys swallowed a sob, stepping back. Yora tightened his grip gently, guiding her away. She managed to nod at the priests. "Thank you for your honesty," she said hollowly. "I must consider this." Without another word, she turned and walked from the temple, Missandei and Yora flanking her, the unsullied guard trailing behind. The smoke-laden air outside felt suffocating, the throngs of worshippers pressing in. Daenerys could hardly breathe. She pushed through the crowd until she emerged into the open street. The lights of Volantis shimmered, but all she felt was darkness creeping into her soul. At last, she stopped in a quiet corner near an alley, leaning against a stone wall to catch her breath. Yora and Missandei stood close, shielding her from curious onlookers. "That can't be the only way," Missandei said, voice trembling with emotion. "There must be some other path. We'll find it." Yora looked grim. "We knew the Red Temple might be dangerous. Blood magic has always been fraught with horror." He paused, gentling his tone. "Daenerys, we will not sacrifice an innocent. We'll find another path, no matter how long it takes." Daenerys let out a ragged breath, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I won't do it. I won't become my father, or those who used dark sorcery for their own ends." She sniffed, shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. "But then, Drogon remains lost. How many more must die?" Neither had an answer. The city's bustle surrounded them, oblivious to the Queen's quiet torment. Daenerys stared at the flickering torches and looming spires, her mind turning over all the terrible choices ahead. She thought of Drogon's molten gaze, the unstoppable fury in his roar. A part of her wanted to attempt any magic, any cost, to bring him back. Another part revolted at the idea of more innocent blood on her hands. In the end, she could only cling to the vow that defined her. She was Daenerys Stormborn, breaker of chains. She would not forge her victory on the backs of the helpless. She would find another way, or she would die trying. Clutching Yora's hand for support, she stood straight, wiping her tears. "Come," she said softly. "We'll return to the camp. The temple has given us what they can. We must choose our own path now." They made their way through the Volantene streets, each step echoing with the weight of her dilemma. As they passed throngs of strangers, the city's life continued. Slaves carrying burdens, nobles feasting in grand halls, priests proclaiming prophecies. No one knew that the last Targaryen queen walked among them, torn between love for her dragon and horror at what he had become. The crowd parted around them like a river around a stone, and Daenerys felt an unspoken isolation. She was a queen without a crown, a mother whose child had turned monstrous, and a liberator who could not save her own soul from the tangles of fate. Outside the gates, Grey Worm and the Unsullied awaited her return, torches illuminating the makeshift camp. She forced herself to meet their gazes. They respected her as queen, but she knew they suspected how fragile her heart had become. Summoning what remained of her resolve, Daenerys dismounted and said, "We will not linger in Volantis. Prepare the men to move at first light. Our road continues." Grey Worm bowed without question, turning to relay orders. Missandei and Yora lingered, close and silent. Daenerys stared into the night sky, recalling how once she believed she could remake the world. Now she wasn't sure she could even save her last dragon from himself. Yet she would press on, as she always had, battered but unbroken, forging ahead into whatever unknown trials the future held. She inhaled the warm Volantene air and exhaled a vow. She would not give up on Drogon, nor would she damn herself to blood magic. One way or another, the path of the Targaryen queen was not yet ended. She was the blood of the dragon, with or without the beast who had once called her mother. And so Daenerys Targaryen rode on, powerless in many ways, yet determined to find her strength once more in a land that offered no mercy.